Chronicles of the War of Souls Book Series. Book 1 Valerio, The Beginning of the End. Chapter 20. The Mechanicus. The great halls of Nar-Uzdum-Arak, carved into the heart of the dragon's spine, now breathed to different life, slow and heavy, like the breath of a slumbering giant. The air, which had recently run with the groans and the hospital's stench, the cloying, sweetish reek of pus and dried herbs, was gradually clearing, but it grew no lighter. It grew thick with expectation, with the thousands of unspoken thoughts that drifted beneath the vaults like bats circling in the pitch dark of a cavern. Each denizen of the citadel carried their own silence, their own pain, their own stone upon the heart, and from this, the general silence grew dense and taut, like a bowstring drawn to its limit before the shot. Even the echo, usually born from every step in these stone walls, now died, swallowed by this all-consuming, viscous muteness, broken only by the distant, rhythmic dripping of water somewhere in black wells. Alaric, his young face appearing even gaunter and paler in the dim, flickering light of the eternal torches, continued his silent rounds along the familiar paths, carved as if into his memory. He brought water, handed out bandages of coarse yet soft linen, but his gaze, gray and transparent as ashes, was turned inward, to the void where the rough but warm voice of his uncle had once sounded. Sometimes, passing one of the colossal bas-reliefs depicting ancient kings with their sorrows and victories, frozen in stone, he would pause for an instant. His fingers, slender and unnervingly wasted for a youth, would lightly touch the cold surface, and it seemed a shadow from the ancient stone fell upon his soul, thicker and more inescapable. Finn, his silent companion, followed him like a shadow, mirroring every turn, every pause. His single hand would sometimes reach involuntarily for what was no longer there, for the stump hidden beneath the coarse wool of his sleeve, and then a spasm would cross his face, frozen in an expression of concentrated suffering, swift and terrible, like a sudden, sharp flare of pain from a phantom wound, making the heart clench and breath catch. Vrondar, leaning on his long, notched spear, stood by the massive oak valves of the northern gates, his mighty, broad chest, sheathed in worn leather, rose and fell with slow, rhythmic breaths. He was listening not to the silence of the locked tunnel leading to Khazad-Katol, but to the one that reigned within himself. A hum filled his ears, not external, but internal, a low, insistent hum of memories, the thunder of hundreds of his warriors' hosts, the piercing battle cries mingling with death rattles, the last, mute reproachful gaze of Karen. His own wound in the thigh, deeply stitched, ached with a dull, constant pain that resonated in the bone with every movement, but that pain was nothing, a mere trifle, compared to the heavy, sodden weight of loss that lay upon his shoulders. Heavier than any stone block mortared into the walls of this fortress. He was a chieftain left almost alone, a guardian of the boundless free steppes, now locked in the stone, soulless belly of the mountains, and to every minute lived here echo in his heart with a bitter longing for wind and open space. Alina and Torian had found their refuge in one of the quiet, abandoned halls on the upper tiers. Her slender frame, covered in short, glossy fur, still bore traces of deep fatigue in every muscle, and in her eyes, cold and clear as a mountain lake on a windless day, shadows of recent nightmares swam and dissolved. Silently, with movements full of innate grace, she showed Torian how to read the nearly invisible traces in the thin layer of stone dust, how to discern the slightest, ghostly movements of air on the cheek. Her voice, when she broke the silence, quiet and even, was like the distant, soothing rustle of leaves in a deep, forgotten forest. Torian, crouching, listened to her with that focused, almost reverent attention found only in those who, having lost everything, have finally found a foothold in a world collapsed into chaos and ash. In these silent, patient lessons lay not just the dry transfer of survival knowledge, but a strange, unspoken connection between two deeply wounded souls, who had found in each other a quiet reflection, an echo of their own, achingly familiar sorrow. Elodie and Mercil were two phantoms wandering in the grayish twilight of the depths. They could sit for hours, motionless, in the remotest, damp hall. Her waxen, expressionless face seemed a frozen mass beneath which raged a mute, all-consuming storm of hatred and grief. Her fingers, thin and cold as a marble statue's, would sometimes clench with such sudden force that the knuckles whitened under the skin. And in these brief moments, a flash of that very ruthless fire of prophetic vision, searing and pitiless, would ignite and die in her eyes, usually empty and extinguished. Mercil's narrow, golden slit eyes were always alert and attentive. He sat beside her without touching, and his silent, motionless presence was her only anchor in this raging sea of inner darkness. Their bond, requiring no words, was as deep and silent as the intertwined roots of an ancient, lonely tree, plunging into the dark, cold earth. Dummrin and Thorben, these two grizzled, tested warriors whose faces resembled granite fragments of the mountain itself, worked day after day, hour after hour, in the echoing, sweltering forges. The clang of heavy hammers was now not a battle song calling to war, but a stern, methodical hymn of defense, a measured beat counting down the time until the next siege. Dummrin's granite face beneath his soot-streaked gray beard showed nothing but concentrated, unbending will as he slowly paced the fortifications. His heavy, piercing gaze seemed to feel every stone, checking each crack for strength, weighing every weakness. Thorben, his arms covered in fresh pink burns and old silvery scars, confidently directed the work at the forge. His practical, precise mind, like a complex mechanism, endlessly calculated each next step, every possible trap, every field of fire. They rarely spoke to each other, exchanging only spare, clipped phrases, but in their silent understanding occurred lay that very profound strength born only in the hour of greatest mortal danger, when all past quarrels and grievances are forgotten, burned away in the flame of common fear before a faceless enemy. And above all this, above the bustle and oppressive silence, above fragile hope and thick despair, there hung invisibly the immense, crushing shadow of Braid Stoneheart. When he appeared in the main hall, crossing the space slowly and majestically, the air around him grew thick and cold, as in a deep cavern, and even the loudest sounds, the clang of hammers, the whispers, died down, absorbed by his silent grandeur. His stony flesh, fissured like an ancient cliff, had almost entirely healed the terrible wounds, but deep within his eyes, dark and bottomless as the deepest, forgotten mines beneath the mountain, one could read a whole abyss of mute knowledge and quiet anxiety. As ancient as the very hoary ridges surrounding the citadel, he would stand for long periods, his countenance turned to the east, as if seeing through the thickness of stone what was not given to others to see. In his silence, heavy and momentous, one could sense all the bitterness of a dire foreboding, all the inexorable weight of the coming storm, whose first, distant rumblings were already audible to a keen ear. It was in this atmosphere of tense, expectant lull, amidst the hum of forges and the smell of fear, that a conversation about Finn was born slowly, like a shoot through stone. Daryl, whose half-elven blood, subtle and ancient, made him sensitive to the slightest shades of other suffering, to the quiet tremor of pain in the world around him, could no longer stand aside. Keeping his aloof silence, he saw how the youth suffered day after day, how his body, deprived of a part of itself, turned with every movement into a painful hindrance, a reminder of loss rather than an instrument of aid or vengeance. And he saw in this not only a personal tragedy, but a practical problem requiring a clear, if harsh, solution, like a broken blade that must either be reforged or scrapped. That day, in the stifling forge hall, reeking of red-hot metal, coal dust, and sweat, Daryl, who usually kept to himself, broke his habitual, days-long silence. His raspy voice, like stone grating on stone, sounded softly, but with a weighty clarity that made both Dummrin and Thorben look up simultaneously. From the charcoal-scribbled blueprints spread on the table, "His hand," said Daryl, and in his spare words there was neither request nor demand, only a bare, heavy statement of fact, as inescapable as the strike of a forge hammer on an anvil. Thorben, wiping sweat from his sooty forehead with the back of his hand, left a dark, smeared streak on his cheek. His gaze, accustomed to sober appraisal and instant calculation, fixed on the ranger, trying to penetrate the meaning of what was said. "The hand is lost," he replied with his usual unshakable directness, leaving no room for sentiment. "The flesh has knit, the wound has healed. What's the talk about, Ranger? The pain? It will pass, or it won't. One must live regardless. Not about the wound." Daryl slowly nodded towards Finn, who at that moment, standing by a water barrel, was trying to lift a heavy, iron-bound flask with one hand. "About what remains after it. He is young. He has many years to live, if luck holds. With one hand, he's a burden to himself and others in battle and on the road. With a second, even if not his own, even if made of iron, he could become a fighter again, or at least, not a helpless load needing protection." He fell silent, and into his memory, as from a deep, dark well, rose a long-forgotten but sharp, as if from yesterday, image of the past. The damp, slime-covered walls of Almerian's Sura undercrofts, the flitting shadows of alien mechanisms, creatures with faces hidden behind faded leather masks, and the cold, reflected gleam of polished steel in place of limbs taken by fate or war. This memory was as solid and real as the anvil by the forge, and within it lurked not only strangeness, but the seed of a possible answer. The word Mechanicus, hanging unspoken in the thick air of the forge like a wisp of oily smoke, seemed to change the very smell around now, not just coal and red-hot iron, but also the ghostly, alien aroma of machine oil, oxidized copper, and cold, lifeless steel. Thorben snorted, a short, sharp sound full of the deepest, most primordial contempt with which a true master, whose hands create from solid metal, might regard a miserable tinkerer gluing together soulless fragments. Mechanicus, he finally uttered, spitting the word out like a bitter pit. It sounded not as a name, but as a curse, as the name of a disease. Their art is sacrilege to the sons of stone. We dwarves, born in the mountain's womb, are meant to feel metal as living, to hear it sawn in the rough, to reveal its soul in fire and water. We mend broken bones the good, honest way with steel. We temper the spirit in labor, not attach soulless gears and springs to living, trembling flesh. Our steel is armor for the body, a sheath for the sword, a wall for the home. It must serve life, not replace lost pieces of it, not invade it with its soulless ticking. Such work, no. He shook his head, and the copper rings in his beard jangled mournfully. Not within our power, not our kind of knowledge. It's alien, like starlight to a mole. But then his gaze, sharp and penetrating, filmed over with memory, gleamed thoughtfully in the semi-darkness, reflecting the crimson glow of the forge. He slowly shifted it to Dumrin, who stood motionless like a stone sentinel at a mine entrance. But deep within his small, black flint eyes, long accustomed to discerning ore from rock, now smoldered dim but stubborn coals of interested contemplation. Thorben's masterful mind, having dismissed the initial disgust, had already begun to turn the very idea over, like an experienced geologist testing a found stone. Although Thorben slowly, almost involuntarily, ran his broad, Bernan-calloused palm over his copper-ringed, red beard, the gesture was full of heavy thoughtfulness. They say, rumors circulate, old ones, from the time of the great Union sundering. It was whispered then that not all those Mechanicus who served the Empire remained abandoned and lifeless in the damp stone guts of Almerian sewers. No, their main enclave, the most stubborn and independent, left, folded up their lates, packed their blueprints, and vanished into the trackless wilds of the spine. They say they settled somewhere on the wild northwestern slopes, in the iron caves, if the tales are true. Abandoned mines of antiquity, full of hungry ore and silence, a place where they could tinker with their cunning mechanisms, bothering no one and staying out of sight. He raised his eyes and fixed them directly on Daryl. In that gaze was no trace of hope or pity, only a cold, ruthlessly calculated assessment of odds. As before a complex forging job, if such a chance for the lad is truly what you seek, you must look there, in those parts. If they, of course, still live and breathe behind their stone door, and if they agree to help a stranger. His suggestion hung in the heat-shimmering air of the forge, thick with the smell of sweat, coal, and metallic dust. It was not a thought-out plan, not a clear order from a chieftain, but a throw of a stone into the dark well of the unknown, a thin, spider-web thread stretched into utter darkness. And Daryl, standing before the two grim dwarves whose faces were carved with the lines of labor and battle, felt with his whole being the heavy, tangible weight of this hint. He understood, as a hunter understands a beast, that behind this thread might lie either salvation or a new, even deeper abyss full of other dangers and disappointments. The idea, cast by Thorben, fell not on the barren stone of indifference, but onto soul long prepared by a silent decision already ripened in Daryl's deep, unhurried soul. He stood motionless, absorbing with his whole body the familiar, almost biological hum of the forge, this ancient, dwarven him to stubborn labor and unyielding will. In his eyes, with their narrow, mountain-cat vertical pupils, one could read not youthful dreaminess, but the cold, sober calculation of an old ranger weighing every bump, every streamlet on an unfamiliar trail, every shadow in the forest thicket. I will go, he finally said, breaking the resonant silence. His words were quiet, but filled with that unshakable inner will capable of slowly, but surely moving mountains and changing river courses. We will go. I am the young ranger, eyes to spot a false trail, and ears to hear the creak of stone, to scout out these iron caves, to learn if the Mechanicus still breathe their land metal, or if only the wind howls in their empty halls. He slowly shifted his heavy, piercing gaze from Thorben to Dumrin, seeking in their flint-hard faces not permission he needed none but a deep, silent understanding. That nod which meant, "Your path is perilous, but we see its necessity." Perhaps they have long forgotten the greater world beyond their minds, Daryl continued, his raspy voice measured and calm. Perhaps they care not a whit for our war, for our pain. That they too live under this same leaden sky, breathe this same cold mountain air, and the darkness that creeps from the east, that which spares neither flesh nor spirit, will not spare their intricate gears or their soldering lamps either. Perhaps an ember of the old alliance still smolders in them, an old memory, or perhaps not, and they will greet us with a volley from their strange crossbows. But it is worth finding out. Any hands, even steel-clawed ones, any mind, even one that thinks differently, any steel, even if forged not in our hearth, may become the very keystone in the arch that keeps the vault from collapsing on our heads. He paused, and his gaze, heavy and inexorable as a falling stone, fell upon Finn, who, catching his name in the conversation, had frozen by the rough stone wall, leaning his shoulder against it, his single hand convulsively whitening the knuckles as it gripped the thick woolen edge of his own clothing. "Him I will take with me," Daryl declared, and his voice held not a drop of plea or doubt, only simple, indisputable fact, like night following day. "If we find these masters, they will need to see living material for their work, to see the pain in the eyes, the clumsiness of movement, the impotent rage that can be a stronger argument sometimes than a sack of gold." And he himself, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the pale, sheet-white Finn, needs to see with his own eyes that his life does not end with this loss, that losing one part, even an important one, does not yet mean losing the whole, does not mean the end of the road. Then he turned back to the dwarves, and his raspy voice sounded practical, precise, measuring each word like a step on a dangerous path. "We will need guides, your dwarves who know every outcrop, every crevice on the northwestern slopes of the spine, those who can lead us by the shortest and least noticeable trails, avoiding rockfalls and old blockages. The faster we go, the faster we return, empty-handed or with hope." Dumrin, who had kept silent until now, silence like that before an earthquake, slowly nodded. His granite, inscrutable face did not twitch a single muscle, but deep within his small, deep-set eyes, like a distant light at the end of an endless mine shaft, glimmered and did not go out a weak spark of approval. He saw in this enterprise not just sentimental pity for a cripple, but a subtle strategic move, an attempt at reconnaissance and the gaining of a possible, even if most ghostly, ally, while also returning to the ranks one who, with a new hand, could become a full warrior again, not a burden. "You shall have your guides, Ranger," he rumbled, his voice low and thick like a distant, subterranean rockfall, the rumble of shifting strata. "The Copperbeards from Thorben's clan remember those trails. Choose to you deem reliable, they will lead you." Thorben, already mentally sorting through his kin, assessing one's endurance and another's keen sight, merely gave a short, stifled grunt, wiping his sweaty, greasy palms again on his coarse, smoke-reeking apron. His pragmatic, habitually weighing mind was already dispassionately calculating the gains and losses, as if drawing up a construction estimate. 2 seasoned dwarves for several weeks, if not months, to risk, of course, great they might not return. But if this outlandish affair succeeds, the mere news of a skillful mechanical hand, of mind's triumph over mutilation, could lift the spirits of all the citadel's inhabitants. More than a dozen newly forged sharp halberds, or a full storehouse of provisions. The decision was made without extra words, without arguments or oaths, quietly and finally, as molten metal solidifies in a casting mold, in the stifling, superheated air of the forge, reeking of age-old dust and heavy labor, hung a new, unfamiliar task, a new trail leading from the familiar gloom of the underground halls into the icy, blinding unknown of snow-clad passes and deaf ravines. And for Finn, who stood pressed against the cold stone, pale, with wide, stunned eyes, for the first time in all those long, hopeless weeks, a glimmer appeared in his extinguished, dead gaze, not hope that was still infinitely far off, but a weak, bewildered, almost childlike interest. The first crack in the thick icy shell of despair that had grown around his heart. The preparations were brief, austere, and businesslike, as befitted those whose lives had been measured since childhood in miles of hard roads and sudden dangers. Daryl and young Rion, the ranger remaining in Nar-Uzdum-Arak, had no extra belongings, only tested weapons lying in their accustomed places. Tight bundles of salted dried meat, hardtack, and dried venison. Tightly rolled cloaks of coarse wool greased against rain, and heavy waterskins with cold, good-tasting water. To them, without ceremony, joined to dwarves of the copper-beard clan Borin and Carl. Boring, stocky and taciturn, with grey mustaches tightly braided into thick plaits lying on his bull-strong chest, seemed carved from the same dark, eternal stone as the tunnels themselves. Carl, younger, with the perpetually squinting, myopic eyes of a cartographer, accustomed to peering at the smallest details, even on the move, consulted a cracked, bark-like hide of an ancient scroll, covered in tiny, precise runic marks and symbols, understandable only to his kin. Finn was outfitted for the march with that practical, sentiment-free care dwarves show for necessary equipment. His thin frame, still weakened after illness, was almost lost in the warm, rough, sheepskin and smoke-smelling clothing hastily matched to his size. The stump of his right hand, already healed with a pink, tender scar, was tightly and neatly bandaged with clean strips of linen and securely hidden from the biting cold under several layers of cloth. When they handed him a small, but incredibly sturdy leather travel bag, he could carry over his shoulder with his left hand alone. A shadow of his former, almost forgotten resolve slowly crossed his face, frozen in a mask of suffering, as if deep in his consciousness stirred a vague memory that he, once, in another life, had also been capable of independent action, not just passive acceptance of aid. They were seen off without ceremonial speeches or farewell cries, in a grim, heavy silence full of unspoken thoughts. Vrondar, leaning on his long, scarred spear, silently nodded by the massive valves of the western gates, and in that nod was all the restrained bitterness of a warrior sending others into danger, while forced to remain. Elodie, standing in the gray shadow of a stone arch, watched them go with her icy, piercing gaze, which held not farewell or good wishes, but only tense, predatory expectation. Perhaps he saw in this expedition nearly a delay for her own plans, one more small but necessary step toward future, sweet vengeance. Elric merely watched them go in silence, leaning against the cold door jamb, his face pale and frightened like a leveret's, his thin, tail fingers convulsively clutching and unclenching the coarse edge of his own cloak. The western gates, with a groan like that of a dying giant, slowly swung open, admitting the small, fragile party into the damp, impenetrable embrace of the familiar dark. The first days of the journey, they traversed the wide, titanic halls that had once been the main arteries of the mighty dwarven kingdom, roads for whole armies and caravans. Here the vaults were lost in impenetrable heights, and the echo of their cautious steps rolled thunderously under these stone heavens, sadly reminding of long-extinguished greatness. The air was dry, dead, and motionless, smelling only of age-old, finest stone dust that covered everything in a thin, velvety layer. Borin and Carl's torches, smoky and crackling, snatched from the eternal dark colossal, three-arm-span columns, roughly hewn bas-reliefs of bearded ancient kings and forgotten, ditter battles, depolished to a mirror granite of the floors, burnished over centuries by countless souls. But soon, after several long hours' march, the dwarf guides confidently turned into an inconspicuous side passage, a narrow, almost invisible crack in the wall, camouflaged by a natural bulge of rock. The whole world around them instantly changed, shrank, became cramped and hostile. The majestic, empty halls gave way to tight, low tunnels hewn into and touched, wild rock. Here were no proud bas-reliefs or smooth columns, only rough, uneven walls from which moisture sometimes oozed, gleaming in the firelight, leaving long, dark, shining streaks on the dark stone, like tears. The air grew heavier, damper, carrying a sharp, acrid smell of sulfur, wet clay, and something musty, as if rotting in the depths. They passed silent, long-abandoned mines. Beyond warped iron grates gaped, like black gulfs into the underworld, the mouths of shafts plunging into unknown, frightening depths. From some came a faint, soul-chilling draft smelling of icy mystery and grave damp. Rion, with his keen, innate elven hearing, would freeze in place, holding his breath, listening to distant, incomprehensible, nerve-tingling rustles and whispers from these stone throats. Finn, walking in the wake of Daryl's unbending back, looked at these mute traces of bygone labor with a mute, dull question in his extinguished eyes, as if straining to imagine how life had one seat here. Picks had rung, carts had creaked, and rough, thunderous voices had been heard. Their path, relentless and stubborn, lay ever upward along a barely perceptible slope. The tunnels coiled in fantastic serpentine labyrinths, sometimes narrowing so that even the short dwarves had to bow their gray heads, sometimes unexpectedly opening into small, round caveways where stalactites on the ceiling, hanging like stone icicles, almost met stalagmites on the floor, creating bizarre, frightening stone forests. Sometimes the trail was blocked by ancient collapses, overgrown with milky calcite flows, piles of sharp debris, under which could be glimpsed vague outlines of broken carts and beams crumbling to dust. Borin and Carl, without a single extra word, merely exchanging eloquent glances, found detours narrow, wet crevices where they had to move sideways, tenacious stone ledges over black, bottomless chasms they had to climb, holding their breath, or half-flooded grottos of icy water, or the dark, motionless water came up to their knees, and they waded heavily and resonantly, shivering from the bone-piercing cold. Daryl always walked ahead, his silent, fluid stride seeming almost unnatural, ghostly in this realm of gravel-crunching underfoot and echoing steps. His eyes, long trained to distinguish shades in semi-darkness, constantly, tirelessly slid over walls and ceiling, absorbing every new detail, every fresh crack, every chip. He rarely looked back, his face turned forward into the dark, but with every muscle of his back, he always knew and felt where each of his companions was, hearing the rhythm of their breath. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw how Finn, gritting his teeth and clinging with one hand to slippery ledges, overcame each new obstacle with a mute, desperate stubbornness that had long been absent from him. And in this blind, animal stubbornness already lurked, like a seed in stone, to sprout of future, hardened strength. Their journey was unhurried, measured, and arduous as the very beating of the mountain's stony heart. When strength began to wane, legs turned to lee, and torches threatened to burn out and plunge all into darkness, Borin, the eldest and most experienced, would simply raise his gnarled, mighty hand, and the small party would obediently halt in the first available cave, or spacious stone pocket of the tunnel. They chose campsites with cold, professional minds with a single narrow approach to cover easily in case of trouble, and, if possible, near a source of flowing, ringing water, whose soft, eternal murmur at least somewhat broke the oppressive, absolute silence of the underworld. They built fires sparingly, economically, from dry splinters saved from the citadel and chunks of a resinous, oily fungus the dwarves called stone candle. The flame was low, blue at the base and yellow at the tips, heavily smoky, but its scant warmth was enough to slightly drive off the penetrating, bone-deep damp. And its trembling, an even like cast giant, dancing, writhing shadows on the rough walls, in which imagination glimpsed vague outlines of forgotten monsters and ancient stone spirits. Immediately after setting up camp, even before unrolling cloaks for rest, they would silently and efficiently post a guard. They did this without discussion, by established, turn-based order, as befitted seasoned travelers who knew the price of vigilance. Usually Daryl took the first watch. His half-elven senses, honed by long years of life on wild trails, were sharpest in this pitch-black, deceptive dark. He would sit by the very entrance to their temporary stone refuge, wrapped in his gray, ash-colored cloak, his immobile figure almost merging with the stone's texture. Only the golden, flickering firelight would momentarily snatch from the dark his sharp profile and the cold gleam of narrow, inhuman pupils. Later, exactly to measure hours later, timed by Carl's hourglass, Borin would relieve him. The dwarf's unshakable endurance allowed him to remain motionless for hours, listening to the familiar, breath-like noises of the underworld, the drip of water, the quiet creak of rock, and catching the slightest, weakest dissonance in their monotonous chorus. Then Carl would take his turn, and in the very early morning, when sleep is heaviest and the body craves rest, Rian would rise, wrapping himself in his cloak and peering tensely into the dark with his large eyes, now full of weariness but still keen. They sat huddled close by the scant, smoky fire, warming fingers numb and white from cold, and ate their meager, austere rations in silent stuffed strips of jerky requiring long chewing. Dwarven bread of coarse ground barley flour hard as a river stone, washing it all down with icy, teeth-burning water from an underground stream. And then, in those long, quiet hours between sleep and watch, when the body rested and the mind, freed from the journey's burdens, began to wander, sparse, broken conversations would occasionally rise, interrupting the monotonous noise of falling drops. "Do you think they're still there, Daryl, those Mechanicus?" Rian asked once, overcoming his usual timidity. His young, almost childlike face, lit from below by the trembling flame, was turned to the experienced ranger, and in his eyes was not just curiosity, but a deep, aching need for hope. The ranger, unhurriedly, turned a stale biscuit over the hottest part of the fire, trying to soften it slightly. His eyes, reflecting the fire, were narrowed, his gaze fixed on an invisible distance beyond the cave walls. Don't know. Those rumors are years old. They could have vanished long ago, gone further still, or simply died out in their iron dens, or— He paused, and a hard, heavy note entered his voice. They could have become something other than what they once were. Time wears even diamond, changes even iron, rust heats the hardest steel. And if they are there, if we find them, will they agree? Rian pressed with youthful stubbornness, his fingers fiddling with the edge of his cloak. They have their own laws, their own measures, Daryl answered hoarsely, tersely. Their own old, rusted accounts with the world. Perhaps they have no concern at all for our wars and our pain beyond their small, closed world. They've locked themselves in their carefully guarded caves like an old turtle in a stone shell, and listen only to the ticking of their mechanisms. But he bit off a piece of the biscuit, the crunch loud in the silence. A turtle's shell can be cracked if one tries. It all depends on what's inside living flesh or just dust. Boring, sitting a little apart, mending a broken strap on his battle axe with thick, waxed thread, merely grunted without looking up from his work, his thick, deft fingers moving confidently and quickly. The darkness coming from the east doesn't ask if you want to fight or prefer to sit in your corner. It doesn't send heralds or declare war. It just comes, like frost or plague, and sweeps away everything in its path, not distinguishing between friend or foe. Their clever gears and hissing steam engines won't save them. If the very mountain beneath them shakes to its foundations, they will either understand this simple truth before it's too late, or die in their burrows without ever understanding why the light in their lantern suddenly went out. And all the wheels stopped. Finn, sitting in the farthest corner, back against cold stone, listened silently, unblinking. His single hand lay on his bent knee, and his thin, tail fingers periodically clenched and unclenched involuntarily, as if trying to grasp an invisible object. He looked at the smoky, twitching flame, and in his extinguished, empty gaze, nothing seemed reflected but indifference. Yet when Boren spoke in his hollow voice about the all-consuming, blind dark, Finn's eyelids trembled almost imperceptibly, and he instinctively, sharply covered his bandaged stump with his healthy palm, as if trying to protect the vulnerable spot from an invisible, but already familiar threat, from his nightmares, which appeared to him in his dreams as black, formless shadows. That shaman, the one from the east, Carl said quietly, more to himself, as if thinking aloud, not looking up from studying his precious, battered map in the dim light. He is not just a chieftain, not just a commander. He remakes everything around him, the very earth, the very essences that live in it and on it. They whisper in his camp, in that very iron maw. He doesn't just gather troops, he creates new creatures, molds them from flesh and clay, binds them with iron and sorcery. He slowly raised his eyes from the parchment and looked around at his companions. In his usually calculating, calm gaze now lay not superstitious, savage horror, but a cold, soul-freezing, analytical fear of a scholar or engineer confronted with a phenomenon breaking all known laws of nature. If those rumors are true, even a grain of truth, then no walls, not even the thickest dwarven walls, will stand long against such an onslaught. Something more is needed than new halberds and reinforced gates. Something, a different weapon, a different mind, or else all is lost. These words, quietly spoken in the tight, close circle by the tiny, trembling fire, in the very depths of the silent, indifferent stone masses, sounded especially ominous and prophetic, like a tocsin in an empty cathedral. They were not just an exchange of opinions or idle talk from boredom. They were a timid, but desperate attempt to comprehend an incomprehensible threat, to find some place for it in their former, already shattered worldview. And everyone in this small, lost party, from the gray, seasoned dwarf to the young, mutilated cripple, understood in the depths of their soul, they were going now not just for a mechanical hand, not just for a chance for one man. They were going for a spark of a possible answer to the monstrous question that would soon have to be asked of the entire living world, and on the answer to which depended whether this world would continue to exist. Days passed, uniform and heavy, measured by scant hours of restless sleep, by smoldering embers and long, exhausting marches in the unblinking, eternal dark where time lost all meaning. The tunnels grew ever narrower, more twisted, and more unwelcoming, like thin, constricted veins in the petrified body of an ancient mountain. The air rang with that eternal, absolute silence, broken only by the muffled echo of their own cautious steps, the squeak of leather shoes on gravel, and rare, distinct drops of moisture falling from a distant vault into invisible, black underground lake somewhere below. Sometimes the path led them along the very edge of bottomless, soundless chasms, where far below, in impenetrable, thick dark, only occasionally, every 100 paces, would gleam man-vanished stagnant water, dully reflecting the yellow glint of their torches, like distant, dead, cold stars in night sky. Finn, despite exhaustion, pain in the non-existent limb, and general weakness, held on with that stubborn, silent stoicism that truly inspired admiration. He gradually learned to manage more deftly with one hand tying a belt, adjusting his pack, drinking from a flask. His previously empty, detached gaze began to acquire the concentration of an attentive student absorbing the harsh, but necessary lessons of survival in this stone hell. Rion, on the contrary, grew more withdrawn and quiet with each day. The long, tormenting stay in the stone womb, far from sun, wind, and the scent of the forest, unbearably oppressed his half-elven, open space-yearning soul. He often froze at halts, sitting hunched, listening to the crushing silence. In his large, beautiful eyes, usually so clear, now lay a deep, almost physical longing for a different, living world left far above their heads, beyond miles of impassable stone. One day, after squeezing through an especially narrow, damp crevice where they had to crawl, almost pressing into cold clay, they unexpectedly emerged into a hall of such incredible, titanic size that their pitiful, flickering torches could not illuminate not only its vaults, lost somewhere in invisible heights, but even the opposite wall. The air here was completely different, not stagnant, musty, and dead, but filled with a powerful, barely felt on the skin, audible to the inner ear movement coming from afar, like the breath of a sleeping dragon. And through this strange, vibrating air came a dull, swelling, continuous roar, like distant, subterranean thunder or the hum of a giant, invisible hive where millions of iron beasts toiled. Borin and Carl froze in place, as if rooted, and exchanged glances. In their eyes, accustomed to all the oddities of the underdeep, flashed something more than usual wariness. The old dwarf slowly, with effort, raised his torch as high as he could, and his narrow, deep-set eyes squinted, peering tensely into the impenetrable dark ahead, trying to penetrate its essence. "We are not alone here now," he wheezed, his voice stifled, and it held not fear, but rather heavy, weary knowledge. And then, from the very thick of the dark, born from the very substance of darkness, lights began to slowly manifest, first one, lonely and yellow, then another, a third, and soon the entire distant, invisible part of the hall shimmered, streamed with hundreds, then thousands of fiery points, moving rhythmically and inexorably in their direction. The roar, previously a distant rumble, intensified with each second, now forming into a heavy, rhythmic, stone floor-shaking tread of thousands of iron-shod boots. The dry, metallic clang and grind of armor, the subdued, low hum of many voices speaking in the guttural dwarven tongue. Before them, filling the giant hall from one invisible wall to the other, moved slowly, like a mighty avalanche, an entire army. Not a small party, not a scattered clan and army, organized and terrible in its disciplined might. Hundreds, if not thousands of dwarves of all ages and ranks, they marched in dense, unbroken formation, occupying the entire width of the titanic passage. Ahead, like an iron wedge, walked warriors armored in dark, matte steel, with gray beards plaited into complex battle braids. Their faces under-lowered, slit-visored helmets were stern and inscrutable as the mountain peaks themselves. In the very center of the endless column rumbled and creaked dozens of heavy wagons, loaded with tightly packed sacks of provisions, barrels of water, and disassembled, formidable siege engines. The air hummed and trembled from their precise, measured step, rang and clattered with thousands of steel parts. This was not just the movement of a host, it was the very breath of war, slow, inevitable, and all-crushing, now passing through this ancient, forgotten by all hall. Daryl's small party stood frozen, pressed against the cold, rough wall, mesmerized and simultaneously crushed by this unexpected, formidable spectacle. They stood like tiny grains of sand on the shore of a giant, slow stone river flowing past them, powerful, relentless, born in the deepest mountain bowels and driven by a single, iron will. The hum of thousands of steps, the clang of steel, and the low babble of voices created physical pressure on eardrums, making the heart beat in time with this alien, majestic rhythm. One mighty, gray-bearded warrior in heavy armor, covered with deep notches and dents, detached from the head of the column man with heavy, measured strides approached them. His iron-shod boots boomed hollowly on the stone. His gaze, sharp and appraising as a mountain eagle's, slid over Daryl's strange figure, lingered on Rion's young, pale face, paused for a moment on Finn with his empty sleeve pinned to his chest, expressing a silent, swift assessment of the injury, and finally fixed on Borin and Carl. "From where and to where do you journey, kinsman?" he thundered, his voice low and thick like the grinding of boulders in a landslide, easily overriding the general hum of the thousand-strong throng. Borin straightened his back, giving something between a respectful nod and a short but deep bow that warriors of equal rank exchange. "We come from Nar-Uzdum-Arak, elder, from the very citadel. We go on business of the High King and by the will of our clan, to the wild northwestern slopes of the Spine. And you, I see you set your path straight to our hearth, to our home." The gray-bearded dwarf gave a stern, single nod, and deep within his small, dark-bead eyes flare and burned a familiar, inextinguishable fire, the very one that had once burned in Dumran's eyes, the fire of unshakable resolve and readiness for the final battle. "Word has come, reach even the distant outposts, of the fall of Khazad-Bitol, of the oath sworn, of the new darkness that creeps from the east and spares neither stone nor steel." He struck his armor, scar-riddled chest with a force that rang, his gnarled, age-calloused fist thudding against the metal. "It is not fitting or honorable for the sons of stone to hide in warm burrows, when the fate of all our kindred, all clans under the mountain, is being decided. We come to stand shoulder to shoulder with you, with those who took the first blow, before it is too late to close ranks." He again swept his heavy gaze over the small, pitiful against his host party, and this time, behind the stern armor of inscrutability, flashed something like silent, spare approval, such as an old wolf might show two young ones setting out on their first dangerous hunt. "Your trail, leading northwest," he growled, "pauses by the fallen bridge at the black waterfall. Be wary there, trust not the look of the stones. They are restless there, stirred by any cry. May the spirits of the ancestors be with you, and may the light of your torches not go out." Without awaiting an answer or thanks, he turned on his heavy soles and with the same measured, unhurried gait returned to the moving, seething river of his warriors, vanishing among them. The column continued its endless march, not slowing for an instant, disappearing into the dark maw of the southern tunnel leading straight to Nar-Uzdum-Arak. The hum, tread, and clang gradually faded, dissolving into the crushing dark, leaving behind only a long, weakening vibration in the very stone underfoot and the thick, acrid, dusty air smelling of iron. Daryl's party stood for a long time in complete, stunned silence, staring into the black maw of the tunnel that had swallowed the army. For Borin and Carl, this was a sight filling old, weary hearts with grim pride and a warm, unfamiliar hope they were not alone. For Rion, with his longing for the world, it was a living, thunderous proof that the world was larger, more complex, and more terrible than he had thought sitting in the citadel. For Finn, with his empty sleeve and empty soul, it was another mute but clear reminder of that all-crushing war that had already broken his life once and, it seemed, was only beginning. And Daryl, looking in the direction where the last rank of steel-clad dwarves had vanished, thought of something else. He thought that even such a crude, titanic force, forged in the mountain's depths, might prove brittle and insufficient against what the shaman brought from the east, and that their own, small and quiet, almost stealthy mission might, in the end, be more important than any rumbling, thousand-strong host, for it sought not brute force, but mind, not numbers, but a miracle. The silence that reigned after the last echo of the departed dwarven army was utterly different, not empty and oppressive as before, but strangely full, as if the very stone memory of this giant hall still long held in its pores the hum and tread of thousands of shod steps, giving it back as a ghostly echo into the quiet. Only when the last, weakest vibrations finally die, absorbed by the eternal, all-consuming silence of the underworld, did Daryl slowly, as if awakening from a heavy dream, turn to his companions. His face, lit now only by the yellow, uneven light of their own torches, was inscrutable and cold as an ice wall. "To fallen bridge," he said quietly, enunciating each word, and they sounded not as information, but as a heavy, inevitable sentence. So, there lies our way. We go. No time to waste. Borin, without a word in reply, merely gave a heavy nod of his gray, mighty head and, retrieving his precious scroll, again took the lead without complaint. They turned into the indicated side tunnel, narrow and unremarkable, and the world around them again sharply narrowed, constricted, becoming cramped, hostile, and unfamiliar. The air here was dead, still, and stagnant, smelling of wet clay and an ancient, long-ago rockfall. Traces of former, skillful dwarven masonry even seams, chisel marks became rarer, then vanished entirely, yielding to wild, uneven, living stone covered in bulges and cracks, as if they now walked not a road, but an old, unhealed wound in the very body of the mountain. Soon they heard at first a barely perceptible, distant noise like the howling of wind in an endless pipe, but with each cautious step forward it grew, turning into a low, continuous, sinister drone, then into a deafening, maddened roar that made ears pop and walls tremble. The air began to physically vibrate, making their torch flames leap, tearing from the surrounding dark bazaar, dancing shadows that seemed alive. And then, around another sharp turn, the tunnel ended abruptly, without warning, meeting emptiness. They emerged onto a narrow, slippery stone ledge hanging in the void of an unimaginable, oppressive scale. Before them, below them, and seemingly above them, yawned a giant, black chasm so wide that the trembling light of their torches hopelessly dissipated, not even hinting at the opposite side. Somewhere far below, in impenetrable, pitch-thick dark, raged and bowled a subterranean river with furious, blind force. Its chaotic, wild roar, amplifying many times by echo and reflected from smooth walls, rose to them in a cold, wet wave, and fine spray, turned to mist, settled on their faces and clothes as icy drizzle. And across this monstrous chasm had once spanned a bridge, a creation of ancient, mighty masters. Now only pitiful, ugly wreckage remained of the majestic structure. On their side, from the torn-apart wall, stuck out massive, thick-crusted rust and calcite iron support beams like broken bones. Fragments of stone flagging hung into the void, forming an unreliable, treacherous ledge. On the other, invisible side, in the torchlight, similar sad remains of former grandeur could be guessed. In the middle gaped and filled emptiness, and only in the very bottomless depth, barely visible in the swirling mist, could be seen sharp, dagger-like fragments of piers, all that remained of the mighty arch span. "Damn it all," whispered Carl, for the first time on the long journey, showing genuine, animal alarm. Clenching his map until his knuckles whitened, overcoming vertigo, he approached the very edge of the ledge and, pressing his whole body against the cold, wet wall, peered down into the roaring dark. No way across, no path, no ledge, only along these rusty beams, if they still hold. And even that's no sure thing they'll bear a dwarf's weight. Borin studied the pitiful remnants of the former structure long and grimly, without looking away. His experienced eye, accustomed to assessing the strength of rock and reliability of supports, methodically studied the distance to the first intact beam, the thickness of the crust of red rust and whitish salt deposits covering the metal. Every crack in the stone masonry of the abutment. "We'll cling to these beams, one to the next," he commanded tersely, without extra words. His voice, accustomed to silence, cut through the chasm's roar. "One at a time, no rushing. Test each next step with your foot before shifting weight. Rion, you follow me. Then Finn, then Carl. Ranger, you bring up the rear. Keep your eyes open." Daryl gave a silent, barely perceptible nod. His eyes, narrowed to slits, were already studying the entire hazardous path ahead, seeking the slightest protrusions, chips, any crack between stones to hook fingers onto. "We go. No time to waste." The crossing over the yawning void became a brutal test of physical and spiritual endurance. For each of them, Borin moved slowly, incredibly methodically and cautiously, his stocky, squat body seeming to merge with the old, groaning metal. Every handhold, every foot placement on the slippery surface was measured to the millimeter and incredibly sure. Rion, pale as snow from silent terror, but gathering all his will, followed close behind, and his innate elven agility and sense of balance helped him keep precarious balance on the narrow, ice-slick beams, where every unsteady breath could cost a life. The wind, born from the mad roar of the invisible river below, fiercely buffeted and tore at their clothing, making cloakhands flap like sails, constantly trying to pluck them into the black, roaring abyss. The most difficult, Truly tortuous trial this crossing became for Finn. His body, deprived of a second-hand's balance, constantly, against his will, leaned toward the void. Every step came with incredible, titanic effort of will, making the muscles of his back and legs burn with fire. He moved, almost pressing his whole body into the cold, rough, wet stone of the wall, his single left hand convulsively, painfully digging into any irregularity, any crack between stones, while the stump of his right, helplessly pressed to his body, only pulled him sideways, disrupting an already fragile equilibrium. His face was distorted by a superhuman grimace of ultimate concentration, and animal fear. Salty sweat streamed down his pale, gaunt skin, mixing with the icy moisture of the mist. But he, gritting his teeth so hard they seemed about to crack, uttered not a single sound, asked for no help, did not scream in terror. He simply walked, overcoming not only the physical chasm before him, but the deepest spiritual chasm of his own helplessness and despair. When the last of them lightly and silently, like a shadow, crossed the creaking, denting rusty beams, it was Daryl. They all finally stood on the other side of the monstrous rift, on an equally narrow and unreliable stone ledge. All were silent, breathing heavily and raggedly, pressing their backs to the cold, wet cliff face and gulping the most icy, roar-filled air. Finn stood leaning his head against the stone, his whole body trembling finely, uncontrollably, as with fever, his chest heaving convulsively. But in his extinguished, dulled eyes, for the first time in many weeks, was read not indifference or despair, but only a weary, hard-won satisfaction of overcoming, of victory over his own feeble body and over fear. They did not linger. They could not afford that luxury. After a few dozen more steps along the slippery ledge, risking a fall every minute, they finally found a barely noticeable entrance to a new, suspiciously dark tunnel. Looking back in farewell, they saw only impenetrable dark and swirling mist hiding the monstrous gap, and heard the same relentless, indifferent roar of the invisible river. The fallen bridge was behind them, one more threshold crossed, one more harsh proof that the path to any, even the most ghostly hope, always lies through the most dangerous and seemingly insurmountable abysses. A few more long, uniform days they walked along the constantly ascending, winding tunnels, and with each new step, each turn, the air around them slowly but surely changed. The stagnant, heavy damp of the deep underdeeps gradually gave way to a fresh, prickly cold current streaming from above, carrying with it an elusive, almost forgotten, after long weeks of life under stone scent, a sharp, clean smell of freedom, open space, and frosty wind. The walls around became more porous, roughly hewn, and underfoot, more often than polished to a sheen granite, with sharp gravel and frozen hard as stone clay. Finally, ahead, at the end of another, almost vertical shaft, light dawned, not the yellow, flickering reflection of their torches, but the even, cold, whitish light of a short northern day, weakly penetrating through a thick curtain of icicles and dense snowdrifts clogging the cave exit. The wind, previously only a distant, muffled hum, now rushed into the tunnel's throat as an icy, whistling, full-strength stream, making them instinctively huddle and wrap tighter in their course. Smoke-smelling cloaks, emerging outside, scrambling up the last ice-glazed ledge, they all froze in place, blinded and deafened. After the eternal, oppressive twilight of the underdeeps, the outer world seemed dazzlingly bright, incredibly vast, and frighteningly deserted. They stood on a narrow, ice-crusted stone ledge somewhere high in the wildest, most inaccessible peaks of the dragon's spine. Below, as far as the eye could see, stretched a boundless, seething sea of sharp, white, snow-clad summits drowning in low, lead-gray clouds. The sky was heavy, leaden, and low-hanging, promising a new, furious blizzard. The air burned lungs with its prickly frost, and the wind, meeting no obstacles, howled and shrieked like a wounded beast, tearing at their tattered clothing and pelting their faces with stinging, horizontally flying snow pellets, boring, squinting from the unaccustomedly bright light and shielding his eyes with a gnarled palm. Heavily raised his hand and swept a quick, appraising gaze over the boundless, lifeless white expanses. His thick beard and long mustaches instantly became coated with thick, prickly frost. From here on, only on the surface, he shouted to overcome the constant howl of the wind. His voice, accustomed to cave silence, sounded unusually loud and hoarse. Hold strictly to the western direction, by the sun. If it shows, don't stray, don't fall behind. To journey over the surface became a new, no less harsh and exhausting trial for them. Deep, loose snow clung to their heavy boots, making each step a tremendous effort and sapping the last of their strength. Finn, with his one arm unable to aid in balance, suffered especially, constantly losing his footing and falling face first into the cold, blinding snowfield. Rhiannon and Daryl went ahead, taking turns breaking trail in the untouched drifts, their silhouettes quickly lost and blurred in the white, swirling haze. The dwarves, squat and heavy with armor and gear, sank even deeper into the deep snow, falling in almost up to their chests, but their stubborn, legendary endurance seemed to know no bounds. Soon the low sky kept its grim promise. A sharp, gusty, face-cutting wind blew up, the sky darkened to the color of wet ash, and upon them, unexpectedly and fiercely, fell a true mountain blizzard. Snow now flew not in separate flakes, but in a solid, blinding, dense wall, erasing all visible landmarks, turning the whole world around into a chaotic, formless mess of white murk and howling, whistling wind. Visibility dropped to a few paces, or even to arm's length. The cold, piercing and merciless, penetrated through even the warmest clothing, burning exposed parts of the face and stiffening fingers into icy, unyielding clamps. They walked, almost unable to see each other in the white shroud, orienting only by Borin's hoarse, wine-lost shouts, wading chest-deep in snow, forcing their way through sticky, heavy flakes clinging to eyelashes, brows, and beards. Every step forward was a separate, small battle with the elements. Setting up camp and lighting a fire in such a furious blizzard was absolutely impossible. They simply found some large, overhanging rock offering at least some shelter from the direct, icy stream of wind, pressed their backs together trying to preserve the last precious body heat, and silently, submissively endured the fiercest hurricane gusts, wrapping their heads in cloaks and curling into balls against the all-penetrating cold. Finn endured this torture silently, without a word. His teeth chattered from cold, and his whole body shook with a coarse, uncontrollable tremor. But he did not complain, did not moan. He merely sat, face buried in his knees, staring into the white, swirling shroud before him. In his frost-rimed lashes and dimmed, weary gaze was read the same deep, uncomplaining submission to fate as in the underdeeps, but now mixed with a respectful, stunning horror before the unbridled, blind might of the enraged elements. Daryl, whose half-elven, ancient blood, endured this desiccating, all-penetrating cold a little better, walked without losing direction even in the total white chaos. His inner, inexplicable compass, the instinct of an old ranger that read invisible signs in wind eddies and snow-crust structure, guided them by an unseen thread through the thickest blizzard. When even the experienced dwarf guides began to doubt and lose bearings, he felt with the skin of his face hidden slopes under the snow, guessed the slightest, almost intangible changes in terrain underfoot, allowing them not to stray from the intended westward course and not plunge into one of the many blizzard-blinded chasms. Thus they moved through boundless snows and blind blizzards, through the howling like a lost traveler's soul wind and bone-piercing cold, a tiny, pitiful group lost in a boundless, silent icy desert at the very roof of a harsh world. They stubbornly walked west, toward the mysterious, almost mythical iron caves, carrying with them not only their bodies, but the heavy burden of the last, fragile hope smoldering in their tormented hearts like the soul, weak flame in this merciless realm of ice, stone, and steel. And then one day, when another furious blast of blizzard subsided briefly, opening to their weary eyes the boundless, snow-clad, flat plateau, Rhiannon, walking ahead at that moment, suddenly froze as if rooted and slowly raised his hand. His keen, sharp elven sight, accustomed to detecting the slightest movement in forest thickets, caught there, in the distance, what other tired eyes did not yet see. The faintest smudge of gray against white and leaden. Smoke, he whispered, barely moving lips whitened from cold. This simple, mundane word sounded in the still there like a thunderclap amid the suddenly descended silence. All stopped at once, holding their breath, and began to peer into the white, shifting shroud in the indicated direction. And indeed, against the backdrop of low, leaden sky, over the snow-white, virgin cover of the Dragon Plateau, rose into the cold air thing, almost transparent, but undeniable plumes of smoke. Not one or two dozens, no, hundreds, scattered across the entire visible horizon, as if an invisible giant had pitched a huge, smoking camp in this icy, lifeless desert. So, the old tales didn't lie. Borin rasped with effort, and deep within his sunken, weary. Wine-burned eyes flashed and ignited a weak spark of something like triumph. Victory of stubbornness over doubt. They are here. These Mechanicus, hope, sharp, almost painful as a blow to the heart, lent their exhausted bodies new, inexplicably found strength. They moved forward now, not wandering aimlessly, but purposefully, with new energy forcing their way through deep drifts toward these smoky, living signals beckoning them like beacons in a sea of snow. With each heavy step, the plateau's outlines grew clearer, and the smoke columns denser, acquiring a yellowish tinge at their base. And then, through the last, tattered veil of snow haze, they finally saw what made their hearts freeze in their chests. It rose above the whole plateau, enormous, incredible, frozen in an unnatural, tragically helpless position, like a giant bird forever pinned to a cliff. It was a ship, but not a seagoing or river vessel-en airship, a flying vessel of old epochs. Its giant, cigar-shaped hull, once painted, no doubt, a proud silver, was now covered with brown, rusty streaks and ice-glazed, icicle-like incrustations. It was rammed, with monstrous force, bow first into a vertical, black cliff, one of the lonely, grim peaks rising amid the flat plateau. The plating was crumpled, torn, and bent back like paper, exposing a twisted, buckled metal skeleton of frames and ribs. Broken, bent blades of huge, motionless propellers stuck out of snowdrifts like the bones of a prehistoric, frozen colossus. From all this mass emanated not former might and pride, but a great, mute sorrow, a silent reproach to a departed, forgotten era when elves, men, and perhaps even dwarves, together plied the airy expanses in such winged monsters. It was a monument to the former, seething with life grandeur of the great union, its daring, almost mad dreams, and its tragic, bloody fall. It stood frozen here, at the very edge of the world, like an eternal, icy reminder that the highest and noblest of goals, can in an instant crash, ramming into the insurmountable, stern cliff of reality. All of Daryl's party stood in complete, stunned stupor, unable to tear their gaze from this fantastic, soul-chilling spectacle. Even the dwarves, who had seen all sorts of wonders and ruins in their endless caves, were deeply shaken. Their bearded faces froze in expressions of mute amazement and respectful horror. For Finn, whose young consciousness had not yet recovered from the horrors of recent war, this giant, dead skeleton in the snow seemed not a monument, but an embodiment of something not merely forgotten, but deeply forbidden, frightening, connected to the very force that had taken his hand. And then, as if awakening from a heavy dream, their collective gaze slowly descended from this eternal, icy monument to the ground, to the very foot of the cliff and the flat plateau spread around. There, among snow-clad dunes and ice hummocks, they finally saw what they had sought all these long, arduous days. Not a majestic, skyward city, not nosy forges, but something else, utterly unexpected, squat, sunken into the permafrost, like giant turtles, domes constructed of dark metal blackened by time and soot. From numerous short, thick pipes on their sloping roofs cold and writhed those very same smokes that had drawn their attention. Between these domes, here and there, stood strange, frozen in inactivity mechanisms resembling giant iron spiders with multiple jointed legs. These were the iron caves. Not literal halls in rock, but a stern, practical, closed settlement of survivors, lost on the very roof of a harsh world, at the very foot of a crashed, petrified dream. They had found them. The what they saw inspired not joy or relief, but a dull, soul-chilling tremor and heavy, ill-foreboding expectation. What awaited them behind those silent, metallic doors? Long-awaited salvation, or a new, unknown danger? When they, gathering the last of their strength, overcoming the last 100 paces knee-deep in snow, approached the nearest squat metal domes, the dead, ringing silence reigning around was abruptly, without warning, brutally shattered. First it was a quiet but quickly swelling, humming drone coming from under the ground, as if the very rock and permafrost began to vibrate from hidden work of mighty machines. Then, one after another, with dry clicks and hisses of compressed air, those very same strange mechanisms scattered between the domes came to life. The iron spiders, covered in a thick layer of frost and snow, suddenly shook off these white caps, and their numerous jointed legs straightened with a dull, metallic clang, raising their massive, angular bodies. Spherical devices on 3 wheels, studded with glass lenses, turned toward them with an unpleasant screech, and from their dark depths ignited dull, unblinking red dots like intent, soulless guardian eyes, with creaks and sharp hisses of steam from slots in the very metal walls of the nearest dome. Snaked out, riding, serpentine flexible constructions with rotating sharp, gleaming drills at the ends, which began slowly gaining revolutions, emitting a thin, piercing whine. All this iron fauna, dead a minute ago, was now directed at them, the small party, and in its mechanical, soulless movements lay unambiguous threat. This was not a sudden, furious assault. It was a quiet, demonstrative display of force, cold, calculated, and utterly soulless. The mechanisms did not rush at them headlong, did not emit battle roars, but merely smoothly, synchronously lined up along an invisible but clear line, forming a living, continuously clanging and hissing barrier between the small party and the silent metal settlement. Their synchronous, devoid of the slightest fuss or hesitation movements were frighteningly perfect, precise, and alien to all living nature. Even Daryl, who had seen stranger things in his long life, instinctively tightened his grip on the hilts of his curved, beast-fang-like blades. His predatory eyes with vertical pupils narrowed to thin slits, coldly, swiftly assessing the number, placement, and potential threat of each mechanical sentinel. Rion stepped back a pace, instinctively seeking cover behind Boren's broader back, his young face waxen with tension. Finn looked at these animated, soulless constructions with mute, almost animal terror. His single hand involuntarily reached for what was no longer there, the place where his living, warm right hand had once been, as if he physically felt the intent, scanning gaze of these mechanical, unblinking eyes. Boren and Carl stood shoulder to shoulder, their stocky, squat figures tense like steel springs. Dwarves, whose nature was woven of stone and fire, were used to dealing with the furious might of subterranean tremors, the cunning of cave vermin, and the brute force of goblins. But this soulless, mathematically precise, emotionless power was to them something completely new, inexplicable, and therefore even more formidable and dangerous. "Stand fast, all," Daryl commanded quietly, with a tone of authority that brooked no disobedience. Not taking his eyes off the nearest spider sentinel. "Don't move. No sudden gestures. They are watching, assessing." And indeed, the unblinking eyes of the spherical sentinels slowly, methodically slid over their figures, as if not seeing but scanning, weighing, calculating by unknown algorithms the level of threat emanating from them. The clang and grind of iron momentarily stilled, and silence reigned again, this time not natural, but tense, ringing like a bowstring drawn to its limit before the shot. At this very moment, when tension peaked, one of the dark metal plates on the nearest dome shifted aside with a deep, echoing clang, revealing a black, night gulf rectangle of an opening. In it, backlit by a dull yellow glow, stood an immobile figure from which immediately wafted an icy cold, deeply alien to their living, breathing world. This was a Mechanicus, its body, hidden under multi-layered, old-blackened garments of coarse canvas and rubberized leather, seemed unnaturally angular, rigid, devoid of the fluidity of living motion. The face was concealed by a single piece, rivet-studded helmet with a single wide, round lens for eyes, which glimmered from within with a dull, cold blue light, soulless and all-seeing. That the most frightening, most repellent thing was visible where living tissue met unliving metal. From a slit in the thick glove emerged not a hand, but a chromed, polished to a mirror mechanical gripper, assembled from many steel plates and tiny, precisely fitted gears. It slowly, with a barely audible clicking sound, rotated this gripper, clenching and unclenching it, and this dried, unliving click filled the frosty air with a sense of profound rawness. The figure uttered not a single word, not a sound. It merely smoothly raised its mechanical hand and made a sharp, abrupt, brooking no argument gesture, clearly ordering them to follow. The swarm of mechanical sentinels immediately, with the same synchronous precision, parted, forming a narrow, needle-eye passage leading straight into the maw of the dark, unpromising entrance. A decision had to be made instantly, here and now. Daryl quickly met Boren's gaze with a glance from the corner of his eye. The old dwarf, not taking his stubborn, bloodshot eyes off the shimmering blue lens, merely gave a grim, almost imperceptible nod of his gray head. There was nowhere to run. Behind them lay only the boundless, merciless icy desert. They had come to long and hard a path to now, at the very goal, retreat before the mute ghost of a departed but not dead era. "We go," Daryl threw out shortly, without emotion, and straightening his back hand squaring his shoulders, he first stepped decisively into that black, light-devouring maw, toward complete uncertainty. straight into the very heart of the mysterious settlement, where now awaited them neither long-awaited answer or ignominious, swift death. Daryl stepped into the black maw, and his companions, hesitating only one terrifying instant, silently, one after another, followed him. The heavy door clanged shut behind them with a deep, final clang and hiss of pneumatics, cutting off retreat and leaving them in complete, almost tangible, oppressive darkness. The air inside was thick, heavy, and stagnant, reeking of soot, red-hot metal, coal soot, and something acrid, chemical, tickling the nostrils, a smell utterly alien and hostile to the living, natural world. Then somewhere high above, in the dark, a hidden mechanism activated with a loud hiss and grind of gears. A heavy chain with links the size of a palm rattled over a block with a deafening crash, and in the very center of the vast hall they had entered, with a slow, hissing, serpent-like sound, a blinding light flared. It was not the familiar, warm flame of a torch or the even, cozy blaze of an oil lamp, but a dazzlingly white, sharp, eye-cutting sheaf of sparks erupting from a strange device resembling a huge steel bowl or cauldron, suspended on massive cables from the very ceiling. Inside it, with a low, resonant roar, burned some special, unseen fuel, illuminating the entire giant space with an unnatural, almost ghostly, white-blue radiance. Casting sharp, black shadows, they stood in a vast, cylindrical hall, clearly hollowed from the rock's thickness, but its walls were lined with dark, thickly soot-and scale-crusted metal sheets, riveted together. Everywhere, in seeming chaos, stood bizarre, angular machine tools, vices the size of a man, winches with cables thick as an arm, and piles of incomprehensible, shiny or rusty parts. Along the walls, like blood vessels, ran tangled labyrinths of copper and brass pipes of varying diameters, from which with sharp hisses burst clouds of white, scalding steam, filling the entire hall with damp, oppressive heat. The air hummed, vibrated from the continuous work of invisible, hidden somewhere in depth machines, a steady, monotonous, insistent hum interrupted by the dry clang of gears, sharp exhalations of steam valves, and the screech of rotating dried shafts. They were met not by one, but by several such silent figures as their guide. All were concealed under identical old garments and leather, stain-spattered aprons, and many had complex mechanical prostheses visible instead of hands or legs, steel claws, multi-fingered, precise manipulators, or jointed prostheses emitting a quiet buzzing. Their faces were hidden by helmets, leather respirators, or goggles with multiple shifting lenses, but all, as one, looked at the newcomers through their optical instruments with the same cold, analytical, utterly indifferent curiosity. Their guide, meanwhile, with the same lifeless gesture of his mechanical hand, indicated deeper into the hall, where in the billowing steam clouds could be glimpsed the outlines of a massive lever, valve, and flickering glass gauge-covered door. None of the Mechanicus physically barred their path, but each member of the party felt upon their skin the weight of these multiple, soulless gazes. Finn, pale as death and deeply oppressed, instinctively pressed against Daryl's broad back, his single hand convulsively clutching the rough edge of the ranger's cloak. Rian looked around with unconcealed, childlike amazement and growing fear, flinching at every unexpected hiss or clang in this fiery, steamy, metallic kingdom. Even the dwarves, whose native forges were full of mechanisms and fire, looked stunned and crushed by the scale, complexity, and obvious unusualness of this place. They took a few uncertain steps forward across the slippery metal floor strewn with shavings, and then one of the figures smoothly separated from the general, immobile group and blocked their path, standing right between them and the massive door. This was a taller, broader-shouldered Mechanicus with powerful, square shoulders bearing massive, forged pauldrons connected to a breastplate by bundles of flexible, shiny metal tubes along which, judging by slight, constant vibration, fluid or steam circulated under pressure. Slowly, with dignity, he raised a hand. Surprisingly, this was not a mechanical, but a living, human hand, yet from wrist to elbow covered in dense, blue tattoos of intricate blueprints, kinematic diagrams, and mathematical formulas, and with a clear, imperious gesture halted them, clearly intending a personal inspection. His helmet, equipped with several viewing lenses of different magnifications, was slowly, purposefully turned directly at Finn, at his empty, tightly knotted sleeve, and in this silent gaze was read not interest, but cold, professional analysis. To Mechanicus, with the tattooed hand, made a sharp, abrupt, utterly unfluid gesture, and his silent, hitherto immobile brethren instantly, with frightening coordination, closed a tight circle around the newcomers, cutting them off from the exit. The air, already heavy and stagnant, filled with a new, almost tangible tension of charged silence, broken only by the intermittent hiss of steam from pipes and the monotonous, inexorable hum of mechanisms hidden somewhere in the rock's bowels, which now sounded like a funeral march. The tall Mechanicus slowly, with dignity, approached Finn. Each of his steps echoed dully on the metal floor. His multi-lensed helmet inclined over the youth like a predatory bird's head over prey. The cold blue light of the eyepieces snatching from the semi-dark his pale, fear-distorted face and the careless canvas not tightly drawn where his right hand had been. Finn froze, unable to move, as if paralyzed. His breath became quick and ragged, his chest heaving convulsively under the coarse clothing. He felt upon himself the whole weight of this soulless, intent examination, as if he were being regarded not as a living man with sufferings and hopes, but as an interesting but broken mechanism subject to cold diagnosis. Suddenly, without any warning, the Mechanicus extended his living, blueprint-tattooed hand and with a swift, precise, almost brusque movement poked his index finger directly into the center of Finn's bandaged stump, where beneath the cloth lay the tender, still painful scar. The youth shuddered all over as if from an electric shock and instinctively recoiled, emitting from deep in his throat a stifled, animal sound full of sudden physical pain and deepest, burning humiliation. Daryl instantly, like a spring, moved forward to place himself between them, his hand naturally falling to the hilt of his curved blade, his eyes narrowing to dangerous, fury-burning slits. But the dwarf Borin, whose grip was stronger than steel vices, heavily laid his gnarled, mighty paw on the ranger's shoulder, holding him in place with irrefutable strength. "Stand! Don't move, Ranger," the dwarf hissed, not taking his eyes off the Mechanicus. "Not the time for iron, not now." The Mechanicus seemed not to notice their violent reaction at all, as if it were insignificant background noise. He turned his head to his fellow, the one who had met them, the entrance, and made several quick, abrupt but clearly meaningful gestures with his mechanical claw, clicking thin gears. The other responded with a short series of similar clicks, and an almost imperceptible nod of his helmet. It was a soundless, but saturated dialogue, a secret language of signs and mechanical sounds understandable only to them, inhabitants of this steel hive. Then the tall Mechanicus again, slowly, turned to the frozen party. He pointed first at the pale Finn, then at the massive, condensation-covered steam door deep in the hull, and then firmly, and ambiguously, jabbed the same finger into Daryl's own chest, clearly indicating that only he and the young cripple could proceed further, into the heart of the mystery. At Boring, Carl, and Riand he did not even glance their presence here. In this sanctuary of machines, apparently held not the slightest significance or value. Daryl froze for an instant, his penetrating gaze quickly exchanging understanding looks with his companions. Separation in this strange, hostile, and utterly unpredictable place was fraught with great risk, but they had no other choice now, nor any path of retreat. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod to Borin, transferring to him the silent right of command and responsibility for those remaining. Then he turned to Rian, and his voice, quiet but clear, sounded like an order. "Wait here, all. Don't move from this spot. Touch nothing, even if you're tempted. Keep silent and watch." Then he laid his broad, warm palm on Finn's trembling, cold back, feeling under his hand the fine, uncontrolled tremor shaking the thin body, and gently, but with relentless insistence pushed him forward, toward the tall, soulless Mechanicus. The latter, without waiting, turned on the heels of his heavy boots and, not looking back, led them toward the hissing, lever-covered steel door, straight into the very heart of the mysterious iron caves, where, perhaps, lay that very answer or doom for which they had made this long, mortally dangerous journey through under-deeps and icy wastelands. The tall Mechanicus, approaching the door, applied his complex mechanical hand to a shiny brass panel studded with buttons and levers. There was a sharp hiss of released pressure, and the massive steel leaf climbed aside, releasing a thick cloud of hot air saturated with the smell of machine oils, ozone, and red-hot metal. Behind it opened a long, straight as an arrow corridor lit by similar hissing, flickering gas burners in steel grates. The walls here were not bare rock, they were covered with embossed, intricate bas-reliefs depicting not battles of heroes or faces of kings, The intricate kinematic diagrams, precise blueprints of incomprehensible mechanisms, and geometric diagrams understandable only to the initiated. Daryl and Finn, stepping on the ringing metal grating, followed their silent guide. The youth walked almost without raising his eyes from the floor, his shoulders hunched under an invisible weight, his single hand convulsively, repeatedly clenching and unclenching a fist. White knuckles standing out under the skin, every unexpected hissing exhalation of a steam valve, every dry clang of invisible gear somewhere in the wall, made him startle all over like a hunted beast. The corridor finally led them into a vast, staggering in its giant-scale space that took the breath away even from the imperturbable Daryl. This was a forge, but not the kind, familiar one where dwarves lovingly and meticulously forge each detail in fire and water. Here everything, from floor to highest vault, obeyed machines, the rhythm of steel and steam. Hammers driven by ingenious steam cylinders and flywheels fell upon glowing blanks with deafening, floor-shaking crashes, showering blinding sparks. Endless conveyor lines of chain links and rotating rollers moved parts from one machine to another with monotonous rattle, creating an eerie, soulless symphony of labor. Everywhere stood titanic vices and winches, and in the very center of the hall, like a deity, smoked and puffed a colossal steam hammer, from which emanated unbearable, face-searing heat. Their guide halted by one of the workstations, cluttered not with tools in the usual sense, but with parchment and thin copper blueprints, tiny measuring instruments, and parts laid out in perfect order. At the table, bent low, sat another figure. When she raised her head at the sound of steps, Daryl saw with surprise that it was a woman. Her face was hidden behind a black leather mask with large, darkened glass goggles, but from under its edge escaped strands of gray, shortly cropped hair matted with sweat. Her right hand, from wrist to almost to shoulder, was a most complex mechanical prosthesis of polished steel and brass, and the thin, multi-jointed steel fingers of this hand with incredible, almost living dexterity and precision sorted through tiny, shiny gears laid out on the table like precious stones. The tall Mechanicus communicated something to her silently, with a series of clicks and barely noticeable head movements. The female Mechanicus slowly, as if with effort, turned her head, and her large, darkened goggles stared first at Daryl, appraisingly and coldly, then lingered long on Finn. Her gaze, invisible but palpable as a touch, was like the touch of cold, polished metal, unemotional and studying. She rose unhurriedly from the table and approached Finn. Her movements were fluid but devoid of natural grace. Her mechanical hand extended forward with a quiet, measured clicking. Finn froze in place, locked in mute, freezing terror, unable to tear his gaze from the approaching steel fingers. They touched first his shoulder, a light, cold touch, then just as lifelessly rested on the knot of the stump, not poking or causing pain, but methodically, professionally feeling, studying the shape, the structure of underlying tissue beneath the coarse woolen cloth. Her movements were precise, almost surgical, absolutely devoid of any human pity, compassion, or even simple disgust. Then she just as smoothly withdrew her mechanical hand and made a clear, understandable gesture, first pointed at her own complex prosthesis, then directly at Finn, and after that at one of the nearest, smoking and hissing machine tools. In her gesture was no question, no offer of help. It was a simple, indifferent statement of fact, statement of possibility, the price of which, as well as the terms of payment, remained unknown for now. The female Mechanicus slowly raised her mechanical hand, and, not taking her gaze from the youth through the dark goggles, with measured, dry clicks, clenched the steel fingers into a perfectly even, polished fist. Gears inside whirred thinly, actuators strained. Then, just as smoothly, she unclenched this hand and showed him an open palm, most complex, polished to a mere mechanism of steel and brass, with artful hinges and barely noticeable grooves. This gesture, performed without a single word, was more eloquent than any long speech. This is what I can offer. This is the limit of the possible in this hall. Take it, if you dare, or go away and never return. Choice in this strange place, subordinated to iron logic, was merely an illusion, a thin veil covering hard necessity. They had come to long, mortally dangerous a path through the dark of underdeeps and icy desert to now, at the very goal, turn and leave empty-handed. Daryl looked deeply at Finn, at his frightened, lost, childlike face frozen in expectation of sentence, and slowly, heavily nodded, passing to him the right to decide his own fate. Decide for yourself, he said simply, without consolations or assurances. It is your hand, your life, your choice. Finn stood, pale as a sheet, but in his extinguished, suffering dulled eyes suddenly flashed an unexpected, fragile firmness, as if somewhere in the very depths of his soul was found the last, thin vein of stubbornness. He slowly, overcoming tremor, nodded in response, unable to utter a word. Then, taking a deep, ragged breath, he stepped forward, toward the female Mechanicus and her pitiless world of steel, steam, and soulless, mathematical precision. To female Mechanicus, with a silent, honed gesture indicated a massive, angular chair standing at the very base of the formidable machine tool. It more resembled a torture device with thick leather straps with buckles, shiny steel clamps, and adjustable supports. Finn, pale as the snow beyond the walls of this metallic belly, obediently, like one condemned, seated himself in it. His single, living hand convulsively dug into the cold metal armrest until knuckles whitened under skin. Daryl stood apart, immobile and silent as a walled shadow, but his eyes, narrow and incredibly attentive, missed not a single movement, not the slightest change in the setting. He saw how two other Mechanicus, receiving a silent command by a barely noticeable movement of the woman's head, approached and with quick, professional motions fastened Finn to the chair with sturdy straps, immobilizing his torso, left arm, and even ankles. The youth squeezed his eyes shut, his eyelids closing, his breath becoming frequent, shallow, and ragged, like a hunted beast's. She, meanwhile, paying no heed, turned several massive, rigged flywheels on her machine, with a sharp hiss of compressed air and grind of gears. A massive metal console on a flexible stand descended slowly, like a guillotine, over the chair, crowned with multiple probes, clamps, lenses, and thin, medical needle-like, shiny instruments. The air grew sharply acrid, tickling nostrils with the smell of caustic acid and sterile alcohol. The female Mechanicus took from a table a scalpel with a blade of unnaturally bright, polished two bluish metal. Finn, feeling the cold, sharp touch on the healed but tender tissue of the stump, shuddered all over and instinctively tried to tear free, but the straps held him dead fast. Biting into flesh, Daryl took a sharp step forward, his hand again reaching for the blade, but she, without turning, merely clearly raised her living hand, demanding absolute hold. Her movements were devoid of all fuss, full of a chilling, indifferent confidence, the confidence of a being knowing the material and process down to the smallest detail. The sharp blade entered the flesh in a swift, unwavering, surgically precise incision, opening the old scar. Finn cried out shortly, stifled, as from a sudden blow, and then clenched his teeth to grinding, trying to stifle the groan tearing from his throat. Blood, however, did not gush forth. Instead, the Mechanicus immediately, almost in the same instant, applied to the gaping wound a large sponge soaked in a caustic, chemical-smelling fluid, from which immediately crept acrid, white smoke and the smell of cauterized, sizzling flesh. Finn's eyes rolled back under his lids, his body tensed and arched in a curve of mute, all-consuming pain. But he, to Daryl's deepest astonishment, did not lose consciousness, holding on to the very edge of darkness by will alone. Then began something that made the blood run cold in the veins and the heart clench, even in the ranger himself, who had seen worse wounds and cruelties in his life. To Mechanicus, without looking, took from a metal tray handed by an assistant a complex, shiny construction of polished steel and dark, patinated brass. This was not a mock hand or crude hook. It was a mechanism of incredible, frightening complexity, a power frame resembling an artificial skeleton, with ball joints in place of articulations, thin, web-like spring dampers, and tiny, perfectly fitted gears visible through the lattice ribs of the structure. She again, unhurriedly, bent over the bloodied stump. Now in her mechanical fingers glittered finest needle conductors and microscopic clamps. She began stitching living flesh to dead metal. Steel needles entered skin, subcutaneous tissue, and muscle, drawing after them not threads but finest, flexible steel conductor filaments, which she immediately, with jeweler's precision, secured in special grooves on the inner surface of the prosthesis. There was a quiet, nightmarish grinding, like a whetstone sound. The steel, serrated clamps at the ends of the frame made contact with exposed bone, biting into it, creating a strongest, inseparable bond. Finn no longer screamed. He lay drenched in cold, clammy sweat, his eyes wide open and staring into emptiness under the ceiling, full of inexpressible, frozen horror. He breathed in short, ragged gasps, and down his pale, sunken cheeks flowed soundless tears, leaving wet tracks, but he was silent, passing through the very real hellish transformation, across the boundary between what was given by nature and what only cold, soulless mind could create. Finally, after infinitely long, tortuous minutes, the main frame was securely fixed. The craftswoman, wiping instruments on a sterile cloth, took the next part, a set of polished 2 golden brassplate scales that were to become the external protective shell, a semblance of artificial skin and flesh. She began methodically attaching them to the steel skeleton, screwing in tiny, knurled head screws and snapping miniature but reliable latch locks. Each of her movements was measured to the millimeter. Every quiet click meant another piece of the complex three-dimensional puzzle had fallen into place. When the last plate was installed and secured, she stepped back a pace, inclining her head, studying her work. In place of the living but lost hand was now a mechanical hand, perfectly, eerily replicating the form and proportions of a real one, but made entirely of cold, lifelessly shining metal. Fingers were assembled from many segments, and in the elbow and wrist joints could be seen complex, multi-axis hinges. She turned another flywheel on the console. There was a quiet swelling, as if from a spinning-up motor hum. Finn's mechanical hand suddenly, by itself, twitched. The fingers with a light, dry clicking slowly clenched into a neat, metallic fist. Then just as slowly unclenched. The movement repeated again and again, as if an invisible operator tested the system for functionality. Finn, all in cold sweat with dried tears on his cheeks, looked at his new, shiny hand with mute, all-consuming despair and deep astonishment. Holding his breath, he tried to move the fingers by his own will, mentally ordering them to clench, and they obediently, though awkwardly, slowly closed. Not painfully. It was not painful. It was strange, inexpressibly alien and eerie, as if they had attached to him a foreign, cold, soulless limb that suddenly, at the beck of someone's will, had come alive and begun responding to the commands of his own terrified brain. The female Mechanicus, without a word, detached the flexible hoses of the console, and it with a hiss of released air and grind of gears smoothly rose upward, vanishing in the dark under the ceiling. Then she simply, without the slightest display of fatigue or satisfaction, turned on the heels of her heavy boots and walked back to her workstation, cluttered with blueprints, as if having just completed the most routine, mundane repair of an inanimate mechanism. Her work was finished, and the patient's further fate concerned her no more. Finn sat, still strapped to the cold, uncomfortable chair, and could not tear his gaze from his steel palm, which continued slowly, with hypnotic monotony, to clench and unclench, emitting a quiet, rustling, insect breath-like sound of miniature mechanisms working inside. He had gained a hand. Though what exactly he had gained, a tool, or a part of himself, a curse or a gift, he could not yet comprehend. Daryl silently, with deft movements, unclasped the tight leather straps holding Finn in the steel embrace of the chair. The youth slowly, with visible effort, rose to his feet. His movements were uncertain, shaky, unbalanced from the unexpected, unfamiliar heaviness on his right side, pulling him down and sideways. He did not take his eyes off his new hand, and the expression on his face was a complex mixture of primal fear, physiological revulsion, and burning, almost painful curiosity. He again, slowly, clenched the metallic fingers, this time harder, concentratedly. The phalanges came together with a dry, distinct click, and he felt in the place where living, warm flesh joined cold steel a strange, dull pressure, not pain, but rather an unfamiliar tension, as if something inside had tautened and stilled. "Can you move it? Understand it?" Daryl asked quietly, almost whispering, breaking the oppressive, ringing silence of their corner. Finn silently nodded, still unable to force a single word from his parched throat. He tried to bring the new hand to his face to examine it closer, but the movement came out sharp, jerky, lacking familiar fluidity, and the metallic fingers with a dull, humiliating thud struck his own cheekbone. He shuddered all over as from a blow and instinctively, with fear, jerked the hand away as if from red-hot iron. At this very moment, the female Mechanicus returned to them, stepping silently. In her mechanical hand, she held a device resembling a reinforced leather vambrace or pauldron, equipped with a system of cross straps and small, shiny brass cylinders, pneumatic chambers from which extended thin, flexible rubber tubes. Without extra words, ceremonies, or explanations, she put this device on Finn's shoulder, above the steel joint, and tightly tight, and the straps biting into flesh. Then with quick, precise motions she connected the tube ends to almost invisible valves on the hand itself. There was a quiet, short hiss of admitted air, and the mechanical fingers suddenly, apart from Finn's will, unclenched, obeying not the signals of his confused brain but external pressure from these cylinders. She raised her gaze and fixed her dark goggles on Daryl, making several quick, abrupt but very expressive gestures, pointed first at the vambrace on Finn's shoulder, then touched her own temple, and finally, slowly and with exaggerated clarity, clenched and unclenched her own mechanical hand. The message was clear and brooked no ambiguity. Direct control requires long and stubborn training. Body and mind must learn to speak with iron, in an absolutely new, unfamiliar language of nerve impulses and mechanical responses. Then she indicated the very door through which they had entered, and then repeated the familiar gesture pointed at Finn and at Daryl. The audience was over. They were again, without ceremony, being ushered back into that vast, humming reception hall where their companions waited in tense expectation. When they emerged from the workshop into the main hall, Borin, Carl, and Rian, frozen by the wall under the intent gazes of mechanical sentinels, stared at Finn with mute, stunned amazement. The shiny, polished steel hand, coldly and soullessly reflecting the uneven light of hissing gas burners, looked simultaneously an incredible marvel of engineering thought and the deepest, almost sacrilegious blasphemy against the very nature of the living. "Oh, forefathers," Borin whispered, and in his voice sounded not so much admiration as superstitious horror. "They truly did it. Attached iron to living flesh." Rian, overcoming his fear, took a cautious step forward. "Finn, how do you feel? Does it hurt?" Finn did not answer, as if not hearing. He looked now at one of his hands, the living, familiar one, trembling from experienced tension, now at the other, the steel one, immobile, perfect, and lifeless in its repose. In his wide-open eyes raged a true, mute storm of conflicting feelings. The pain from humiliation and physical torture, the animal terror before the alien, grown into the very core of his flesh object, little by little began to yield to something new, fragile, barely born and not yet realized. It was not joy or hope. It was a cold, sober awareness of a new, frightening possibility, at the cost of incredible pain and loss of part of his human essence. But he could again hold, again take a weapon in hand, again, even if by such a terrible means, be useful. Daryl silently watched as Finn slowly, as if in a dream or under hypnosis, raised his new, shiny hand, examining the play of dull light on polished brass plates and steel joints. In the youth's eyes was read not the joy of acquisition, but a deep, concentrated detachment of a person trying internally to reconcile the part of himself suddenly become alien, cold, and frighteningly perfect. It was at this moment, when Finn studied his hand and the others were in stupor, that Daryl realized he could delay no longer. Time to speak, while the door into this steel world had not yet slammed shut before them forever. He approached the female Mechanicus, who, having finished her work, had again, as if nothing had happened, bent over spread blueprints, as if their dramatic arrival and the entire operation were but a minor, insignificant episode in the endless, monotonous flow of eternal constructing and calculating. "Your art, it is impressive," he began. His raspy, silence-accustomed voice sounded unusually loud and commanding, overriding the crash of the nearest steam hammer. "You have returned to him the possibility to be not a burden, but a warrior. Returned faith in himself." The woman did not raise her head, expressed not the slightest interest, but her mechanical hand, frozen over a complex kinematic diagram, betrayed that she was listening, that her attention, however reluctantly, was engaged. "The one hand, even the most perfect and sturdy, will not win a war," Daryl continued, taking a firm step forward, shortening the distance between worlds. "The darkness creeping from the east knows no distinctions and knows no mercy. It spares neither living flesh nor the heart of steel. The iron shaman who leads it is not merely the leader of a horde. He defiles the very essence of creation, reforging life, soul, and matter into something else, monstrous and not subject to our laws. Your mechanisms, your unique knowledge, they could become that very lever that tilts the scales in our favor, or at least allows us to hold them." He slowly, appraisingly swept his gaze over the entire giant hall. His glance slid over the immobile but ready at any moment to animate soulless sentinels, over the hissing, steam-clouded steam engines, over the innumerable, mysterious machine tools which, he had no doubt, could forge weapons of such power and sophistication that in the besieged Nar-Uzdum-Arak, one could only vaguely dream of. The hordes marching on our walls are numberless as desert sand. His voice sounded even, without pathos, stating a terrible fact. They are supported by creatures molded from nightmare, against which ordinary blades and even dwarven steel are powerless. We desperately need your steel. Your machines, your different, ruthlessly rational vision of the very essence of war. The female Mechanicus finally raised her head from the blueprints. Her large, darkened goggles were immovably directed straight at Daryl. And through the general hum and clang of machines he physically felt the weight of her silent, questioning, and appraising gaze. You think it will not touch you, here in your iron shell? Daryl's voice grew quieter, almost intimate, but from this each word acquired only greater leaden weight. You hide here, at the very edge of a dying world, by the wreck of your own former great hopes. But the dark knows no borders and recognizes no neutrality. It will come here too. First it will be but a whisper in distant, abandoned tunnels, a slight tremor in your pipes, then silence, strange and oppressive, where the accustomed hum of your machines will not be heard. And then, he paused, and in his eyes flared that very knowledge he had brought from his wanderings. Then your steel children, your beautiful, complex mechanisms, will serve not you. Their gears will turn by another alien will, and your bodies will become but raw material for new, even more terrible nightmares. He pointed a firm hand toward the pale, still trembling Finn, whose steel palm quietly rustled. Clenching and unclenching, we brought to your threshold his pain, his suffering, his broken body, and showed you that your art can transform that pain, if not heal it, make it different. Now we bring you our common, all-threatening doom. We do not ask for alms. We offer you a choice, the last in this waning world, to fight shoulder to shoulder, using your unique heart to defend all that yet lives and breathes, or to wait silently in your steel shell until this refuge turns into as mute, icy a tomb as that perished dirigible beyond your walls. He fell silent, letting his heavy, lead-inged words hang and settle in the superheated, thickly oil, ozone, and soot-reeking air. His speech was not fiery, did not thunder or call to feet. It was cold, precise, and inexorable as the work of a giant hydraulic press crushing metal. He appealed not to pity, not to chivalric duty or memory of glory, but to naked, merciless pragmatism and the ancient, animal instinct of survival. To female Mechanicus slowly, as if against her will, rose from her table. She exchanged a long, soundless, meaning-saturated gaze with the tall Mechanicus, who at all this time stood immobile in shadow by a column, like a statue. He answered her with an almost imperceptible, but distinct movement of the head, a short, negating nod. It seemed an agonizing eternity passed in this silent dialogue of gazes, in the quiet ticking of invisible gears of fate and the monotonous hiss of steam escaping valves. Finally, she turned to Daryl, and her dark goggles concealed any emotion. With a gesture of her living, tattooed hand she pointed upward, at the metal, soot-blackened ceiling of the workshop, and then slowly, very slowly, with apparent effort, clenched her mechanical hand into a polished, impeccable fist. The gesture was clear and brooked no misinterpretation. Our interests are here, in these halls. Our war is behind these walls, and it is waged against imperfection of material, against friction and wear, not against living beings. They refused, finally and irrevocably. But then her steel hand unclenched, and the fingers made a new, abrupt gesture. She pointed again at that same Finn, then sharply waved toward the door from which they had come. The message was unambiguous. We gave you a tool. 1. Anything beyond that, your concern, your problem, your war. Their long, desperate mission had achieved its small, utilitarian goal, but suffered a crushing defeat in the main, strategic one. They had received a cunning hand for one cripple, but had not received an army of machines, nor an alliance of minds for the whole perishing world. And now before them lay the long, no less dangerous journey back, bearing not hope for salvation, but only a fragile, metallic, soullessly shining reminder that in the coming universal war they would have to rely only on their own strength. The silence that followed this mute but clear refusal was thick, heavy, and oppressive as molten slag pouring from a crucible. Daryl already mentally saw their return path long, full of hardships and dangers, and at the same time meaningless in its global failure. With a single mechanical hand as a pitiful trophy, he saw how the last, most ghostly hope had collapsed, and deep in his weary, much-seen eyes the last spark dying, leaving only cold, ashen pessimism. And then, when all seemed lost, the female Mechanicus made an unexpected, almost sharp movement. She turned sideways to him, and with a gesture full of strange, almost ceremonial solemnity, pointed to a far, dark, smoke-filled corner of the giant workshop where in perfect, impeccable rows, as if on parade, stood dozens of immobile mechanical spiders, those very ones that had met them at the settlement's entrance. She raised her hand, showing first 2 fingers, then spread all 10, and repeated this count twice. 2 dozen. Then she slowly, with dignity, brought her mechanical hand to her own chest, to the area where a living person's heart should beat, and struck the metal breastplate with her knuckles. A deep, symbolic but distinct knock sounded in the workshop's clamor, like a distant, almost forgotten echo of a long-abrogated oath. Then she pointed at Daryl, and finally, sharply, firmly, jabbed a finger in the direction from which they had come south, where in the mountain's thickness lay Nar-Uzdum-Arak. The message was read without a single word, clear as day. "We will not go to your war. Our place is here, at our lades. Though we remember the ring of iron of the great union. Take these sentinels, these are children. Let them be a living if the word is apt here. Proof that not all bridges between our worlds are finally burned. Proof of our acknowledgement, of our respect for your persistence." This was not an army. It was a gesture, a symbol, a negligible, cold spark in the approaching all-consuming dark. But for Daryl, already mentally reconciled to complete, deafening failure, this strange, mute gift was more than nothing. It was a chink in the wall, a crack in the armor of indifference. He slowly, with the same solemnity, nodded, with his whole demeanor accepting this incredible, mute gift. The female Mechanicus, having done her deed, turned and silently departed, dissolving in the labyrinth of machine tools and clouds of white steam, as if her mission here was fully and finally completed, and what followed concerned her no more. Seeing this ghostly procession following Daryl, all froze in mute, stunned amazement, Boren looked at the spiders not with fear but with professional, keen interest, mixed, however, with deep, primal superstitious awe. "Forefathers of caves and masters of mines," he whispered, not taking his eyes off the nearest sentinel, "have they given us their guard? Their iron hounds?" They were escorted to the very massive outer door, the one leading to the kingdom of snow and wind, when the heavy, corrugated leaves with a hiss of pneumatics began slowly sliding apart, revealing the blinding whiteness of the snow-clad plateau and the low, leaden sky. The mechanical spiders rhythmically, one after another, without command, stepped outside and immediately formed a protective square around the small party. Their numerous eyes coldly gleamed, methodically scanning the silent, white space for threats. The door clanged shut behind their backs with a final, irrevocable, hollow clang. They were again alone in the icy, merciless desert, but now they were surrounded by a silent, impenetrable escort of polished steel, brass, and soulless but perfect intelligence. The return journey to Nar-Uzdum-Arak began, and they bore with them not only the wonder-curiosity of a mechanical hand, but also the enigmatic, deeply ambiguous answer of the iron caves, not a firm yes, but not a final no either, something in between, evasive Van Polysimus, that could in the end mean anything from polite refusal to delayed, hidden consent. The return journey began under the incessant, howling accompaniment of a raging blizzard and the measured, dry, clanking step of the mechanical spiders. The steel, soulless sentinels moved almost silently for their size only, their numerous, thin legs, ending in sharp spikes, did not sink into deep snow, but cautiously, methodically probe and pierce the path, leaving behind intricate, spider-web-like patterns on the virgin white blanket. They moved as a single, coordinated organism, forming a living, or rather, unliving but impregnable mobile shield around a small, fragile group. Their presence was dual, simultaneously frightening in its alienness and cold perfection, and yet dully reassuring, for they were power, and this power now, albeit temporarily, served their protection. Finn walked, still immersed in himself, in mute struggle with the new reality of his body. But now his left, living hand at times, almost unconsciously, rose and touched the cold, polished to a mirror forearm of his right, mechanical one, as if checking by touch the incredible reality of this nightmarish gift. He still did not dare consciously, by willful effort, control the new limb, fearing it, but it already lived its own, autonomous, mechanical life, instinctively, through some hidden connections with his nervous system, helping him keep precarious balance on icy steep slopes and cling to ledges. They were already approaching the place where, After several days of hard travel, they should, if Borin's calculations were correct, find that hidden in the cliff's entrance to the familiar underground tunnels, leading straight to Nar-Uzdum-Arak. The sky, all day shrouded in a solid, heavy leaden veil, began to darken further, promising early, long polar twilight. The wind, which had raged furiously until then, for a moment, as if holding its breath, died down. And in the sudden, ringing silence, broken only by the distant, muffled howling of a blizzard somewhere beyond the mountains, became audible their own heavy, hoarse breathing and the crunch of snow underfoot. And then it happened. Without warning, without thunder or rumble, from the southeast, from beyond distant, invisible behind the snow-shroud sharp peaks, straight into the very heart of the hanging, low clouds, pierced a beam. It was not like a lightning strike, nor the reflection, the distant fire, nor any known natural phenomenon. It was a vertical pillar of concentrated, venomous light, the color of clotted blood and molten hellforge, blinding, piercing, and unbearable to the eyes. It cleaved the heavens from the very earth, like a giant, divine spear thrown into the world by the hand of an enraged titan. This light did not illuminate, it burned the gaze, seared the soul. It was the visible, physical embodiment of pure, mad hatred and all-crushing destruction. The crimson pillar stood in the sky for several eternal, stretched-out seconds, frozen and motionless, flooding all the boundless snow expanses with a sinister, unnatural, alien light, from which shadows grew thicker and blacker, and the white snow seemed soaked in blood. It seemed the very sky had torn from itself, this bloody, blazing one gaping over the world. The whole party froze in place, paralyzed not so much by fear as by incomprehension, animal terror before the unknown. Even the soulless mechanical spiders halted as if rooted, their numerous optical sensors together. With a quiet buzzing, turned toward the sinister light, and an alarmed, high-frequency humming of their internal mechanisms filled the suddenly descended silence. The shaman, Borin, exhaled, his voice choked, almost soundless, and in his usually firm as granite voice was heard not just fear, but something more reverential, primal horror before power surpassing all understanding, before a force challenging the very laws of nature. Rion stood, clutching his coarse cloak with whitened fingers, his young face white as the surrounding snow, eyes wide open with mute shock. Finn looked at the crimson, pulsing glare, and his new, mechanical hand suddenly clenched with such mute, ferocious force that the steel fingers, sliding over each other, emitted a sharp, piercing screech. Daryl did not take his narrowed, burning eyes off the southeast. His face was a frozen stone mask, but deep within the pupils raged a whole storm of fury, despair, and cold, calculative understanding. He saw not merely a light phenomenon, not a magical trick. He saw the beginning of the end. He saw the grim, unambiguous declaration of war upon the entire living world. And he understood, with his whole being, that their small, pitiful party, with its one mechanical hen and 24 steel spiders, was too late. The war they had hoped to prevent, or at least postpone, had just begun. And it had begun not with shots or cries, but with a demonstration of power, monstrous and all-consuming, against which any, the mightiest fortress, any, the bravest army, might prove powerless as a child before a raging bull. The crimson beam vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, not fading but as if switched off, leaving behind only a darkened, as if scorched sky and an oppressive, ringing, absolute silence more terrible than any crash or roar. This silence was filled with one single question hanging in the icy, motionless air and pressing on the ears. What now? What to do when the very world, it seems, has turned against you? The crimson, searing scar in the sky vanished, leaving behind not comforting dark but something worse, a blinding green afterimage on a retina and an oppressive, ringing like a taut-string silence in which, it seemed, the very frosty air had frozen and ceased to move. Even the wind, howling and whirling snow eddies a second before, stilled, crushed by the invisible weight of what had just been seen, as if frightened. The first to recover, tearing from hypnotic stupor, was Daryl. He sharply, forcefully turned to his frozen companions, and his face, usually inscrutable and calm, was distorted by rare, burning, almost animal rage and awareness of mortal danger. All of you, quickly, move. Now. His voice, hoarse and strained from tension, cut through the silence like a whiplash on frostbitten skin, making all startle and instantly come to their senses. He did not waste precious seconds on explanations. There was no time for anything. He roughly grabbed the stunned Finn by the shoulder and, without looking, shoved him forward, toward the place where in the snow shroud should be hidden the salvation-bringing entrance to the underground tunnels. "Run. Don't look back," he rasped over his shoulder to Borin and Rian, and in his eyes burned that very cold, pitiless fire seen only by those who had stood on the very edge of immediate, inevitable death and understood that salvation lay only in movement, only forward. And they ran. Snow flew into their faces in a blind, stinging blizzard. Legs sank into drifts up to the knee. Each movement came with incredible effort, but the animal, all-consuming fear planted in their souls, that crimson beam lent their motions feverish, almost superhuman speed. Even Finn, stumbling, falling face first into snow and hoarsely spitting, rose, propelled by Daryl's shove, and ran on. His mechanical hand now not merely hung but instinctively, with a dull thud, caught on icy rock outcrops, helping him scramble forward. Some mechanical spiders, as if receiving via an invisible channel a soundless, a clear command, rushed ahead, overtaking the party. Their synchronous, clanking run on all legs was frighteningly fast, efficient, and flawless. They combed the path forward, their numerous sensors fiercely, ceaselessly scanning the terrain ahead and to the sides, seeking the invisible, but undoubtedly existing threat, so grimly heralded by that monstrous light from the southeast. "What was that?" Rian cried, gasping, his voice breaking from running, barely keeping up with Daryl's long, confident strides and feeling the cold air cutting his unhardened lungs. "A signal," Daryl threw out tersely through clenched teeth, not turning or slowing pace. "The beginning of the end. He calls them all to battle. All the foulness, all the creatures from the deepest and darkest burrows that have slept for centuries. And we must be behind the citadel's walls when that tide crashes against them. We must make it." He spoke no more words. There was no need, and breath was lacking. Everyone in the party understood this viscerally. They had seen not just a strange light in the sky. They had seen the lit, smoking fuse at a giant powder keg upon which, balancing precariously, now stood their entire familiar world. And that fuse was burning down with frightening, relentless speed. Their mad, desperate run across the boundless snow-clad plateau turned into a blind, feverish race against time, against fate, against the very world. They no longer walked, they fell, slid on ice-glazed outcrops, rose, gulping icy air, and ran again, driven by the ghost of universal, total annihilation that had for a moment pierced the sky and frozen in their eyes as a burning spot. The mad, blinding run through the snow whirlwind seemed a small, personal eternity. Lungs burned with fire, temples pounded like hammers, and in the ear stood a continuous, high ringing the after-echo of that crimson, mute nightmare now forever etched in memory. Finally, in the white, shifting shroud of blizzard, the long-awaited dark maw was guessed the entrance to the salvation-bringing tunnels. Usually this sight evoked mixed feelings, but now it was like the view of a quiet, saving harbor in the very midst of a raging, all-crushing sea storm. Daryl, not slowing stride, only bowing his head, first dived into the black, cold maw of the underdeep. After him, stumbling, catching themselves, falling on the ice-glazed stone threshold at the entrance, tumbled in, as if thrown by a wave. The others, some mechanical spiders slid in soundlessly, like shadows, and instantly, with quiet buzzing, took clear defensive positions, blocking the entrance with their angular steel bodies. Their numerous sensors tirelessly, methodically scanned the blinding snow shroud outside, seeking the slightest movement. The first long moments in the relative quiet and safety of the stone tunnel were spent merely catching their breath, letting the heart stop pounding like a mad thing. They sat and stood leaning against the cold, damp walls, their bodies trembling finely from overexertion and fear-induced adrenaline. Finn hunched in a corner, staring at a point on his steel hand, which lay on his knee immobile and lifeless, as if it, like its owner, was in deep stupor. Now it becomes clear why those Mechanicus didn't want to get involved with us," Borin said hoarsely, coughing, wiping sweat and snow from his forehead with a dirty mitten. "That is a force against which," he faltered, twisting his weather-beaten face into a grimace, "against which any steel, any knowledge might prove a splinter, just a splinter. Doesn't matter now what they wanted or didn't want," Daryl cut off, already rising to his feet with that ease given only by iron will. His breathing had evened, and in his eyes, weary but unbroken, again froze the habitual, cold and pitiless resolve of a hunter cornered. "Only one thing matters now. It concerns every living being under this sky, and we must warn our own. Every lost hour, every minute of delay now counts in blood." He threw a heavy, appraising look at his exhausted, haggard companions, lingered on Finn, who with visible effort rose, leaning his healthy hand against the rough wall, his face ash-gray. "We'll rest on the move, if tired," Daryl declared, and in his low, raspy voice was not a trace of room for objection or discussion. "Food and water strict minimum, only enough not to collapse. Sleep in snatches, 2 hours, no more. We know the way back, know all the dangerous spots. We go now." And again, without respite, began the grueling march. Now underground, in familiar but no less grim and hostile tunnels where the echo of their steps sounded like a funeral march. But this time they were driven not by weak hope for a miracle, but by soul-chilling to the very bottom animal fear and fierce, almost desperate resolve to deliver the news. They walked almost without speaking, conserving even words from their last strength. Even Rian, usually full of questions and youthful curiosity, kept tomb-like silence. His young, once open face had during this journey grown older, sterner, and more closed, as if shadowed by adult, unbearable responsibility. The mechanical spiders ran ahead, and to their sides their red, unblinking sensors snatched from the thick dark every crack, every suspicious stone, every sound. They knew no fatigue, knew no fear, needed no food or sleep. They were perfect, impartial sentinels in this stone hell, but their soulless, flawless efficiency only emphasized more strongly a monstrous, transcendent force the Iron Shaman from the east had called against himself and the whole world. And with each step deeper into the familiar, descending tunnels toward distant Nar-Uzdum-Arak, Daryl felt with his whole being the heavy, oppressive weight of a gathering somewhere there, beyond the walls of rock. Universal storm. They bore with them not just news of wars beginning. They bore a sentence, proclaimed by a bloody beam in the sky, and on whether they would succeed, deliver this warning in time, depended now whether their small, fragile world would have any, even the most ghostly, chance to stand against the approaching, bloody and faceless tide. The way back along familiar, winding tunnels was a true forced march, where every halt, even for a gulp of icy water from a flask, seemed an impermissible, treacherous luxury. They walked, laid only by Daryl's fierce, unbending resolve and the scant, ghostly light of dwarven torches reflected in the polished, mirror-like sides of their silent steel companions. And so, after endless hours of travel, before them again yawned the familiar black, bottomless chasm, and came the deafening, many-voiced roar of the invisible underground river somewhere below. The fallen bridge was still their pitiful, broken remains, a mute reminder of the fragility of any, even the greatest creations of intelligent beings' hands. The whole party froze at the very edge of the ledge, gazing with longing and horror into that black abyss. The thought of a new, mortally dangerous crossing along the same slippery, unreliable, rusty beams after all the exhausting journey and experienced terror seemed not merely difficult, but almost unbearable, bordering on madness. And then the mechanical spiders, without waiting for anyone's orders or gestures, came into motion, not chaotic, but astonishingly organized, as if parts of a single complex mechanism. They quickly, without fuss, lined up at the very brink of the chasm, and their numerous, flexible legs with dull, distinct clangs and clicks interlocked with each other, forming strong couplings. The first spider secured itself on their side, releasing from its limbs sharp steel anchor claws that crunched as they bit into cracks in the stone. The second climbed onto its back, the third onto the second, and so on, forming a living, or rather unliving but sturdy chain that slowly, segment by segment, crept across the bottomless void. They did not merely line up. They intertwined, closed into a single lattice-like but incredibly strong construction, a veritable bridge of polished steel, brass, and quietly whirring gears. Their angular bodies became piers, and their interlocked, intertwined limbs a firm, though slightly springy and swaying deck. All this took mere, well-drilled seconds, and now from one side of the chasm to the other lay a swaying, clanking with every step but absolutely reliable path, woven from the bodies of 24 mechanical sentinels. This was simultaneously a marvel of engineering thought and a soul-chilling spectacle, when the unliving demonstrated such coordination and purposefulness inaccessible to the living. The party looked at this mute, spontaneous offer of steel with amazement mixed with superstitious, profound fear before all that was inexplicable. Borin, overcoming initial stupor, first stepped onto the swaying construction, cautiously transferring his not inconsiderable, stocky weight. The deck of intertwined steel legs sagged under him, emitting a quiet creak, but held, not trembling. The metal groaned and moaned like a living being under load, but did not fail, did not come apart. "Come. Don't stand," he shouted, turning, his usually thunderous voice barely audible over the all-consuming roar of the invisible water below, while they hold. Quickly, one at a time, one after another, holding their breath, they crossed the yawning void along this unliving, clanking bridge. Rion, despite trembling knees, slid across the polished, cold metal with innate elven grace, which even all-consuming fear could not hide. Finn, clinging with his single living hand to protruding parts of the improvised railings formed by the dorsal plates of other spiders, traversed the whole way without stumbling once. His mechanical hand now instinctively, apart from his will, helped him catch balance, hooking onto supports. Daryl went last, clearly feeling under his soles how this soulless bridge shifted and sprang. He looked not down into the foaming, roaring dark but at the immobile, red optical sensors of the spiders built into their angular bodies. In these cold, unblinking points was not a shadow of fear, effort, or strain, only absolute, cold execution of an assigned task, perfect functionality. This was the true gift of the Mechanicus, not just soldiers, but universal tools capable of the incredible, of what a living being would never dare. When the last of the party, Daryl himself, stepped onto the firm, reliable stone of the opposite shore, the mechanical spiders, just as synchronously and lightning fast, without the slightest fuss, unlocked their steel couplings. The chain disintegrated into component parts, and they one after another, lightly and gracefully, crossed to their side, their numerous legs again tapping on stone the same measured, relentless tattoo. The bridge vanished, as if it had never been, dissolving into 24 separate entities. They were again merely a silent escort. But in the memory of each, from Rion to the seasoned Borin, was forever etched this eerie and simultaneously majestic spectacle, the soulless, precise mind extending a helping hand to them in the most literal, physical sense. And this made one think, made one grow cold inside. What else could these strange beings of steel and gears do? And what terrible price, in the end, would have to be paid for their aid when the real, all-crushing war finally came to their own, locked threshold? After the incredible bridge of living metal, the remainder of the journey along familiar, winding tunnels passed in almost complete, heavy silence. Even the habitual, eternal hum and whisper of the underworld, the drip of water, the creak of rock now seemed muted, suppressed by the unbearable weight of all seen. Both the crimson, apocalyptic light in the sky and the cold miracle wrought by their steel companions. Finn now more often and boldly glanced at his mechanical hand with a new, strange expression, not of fear and revulsion already, but of thoughtful, almost scientific, analytical interest. He began cautiously but consciously to move the steel fingers, making them clench into a fist and unclench, and each time listened to the quiet rustle of hydraulics and dry clicks inside, as if trying to understand the language of this new member of his body. They were driven forward now not only by Daryl's harsh order and duty, but by an internal, unspoken but all-felt knowledge. The world beyond the thick walls of Nar-Uzdum-Arak had already irrevocably changed. While they were on the road, they bore with them now the last tidings from a still living, though mutilated, tasked into a stern present already preparing to meet its own grim apocalypse. Finally, ahead, at the very end of a long, straight as an arrow tunnel, flickered and danced a familiar, warm yellow light, not the cold, even glow of the iron cave's gas burners, but the living, uneven, welcoming flame of huge dwarven braziers and pitch torches. The familiar, thick, almost edible smell was discernible, not of machine oil, but of soot, dwarven sweat, bold root stew, smoke, and warm, native stone. They emerged at the very outskirts of one of the great lower halls, already not far from the citadel gates, and here awaited them a sight eloquently testifying that the time they had so hurried to outrun had not awaited their return and was doing its work. The hall, usually serving merely as a crossroads, had been transformed beyond recognition into a fortified defensive point. Freshly hewn, still resin-smelling beams supported new, crude props in the walls had been hastily punched additional, narrow embrasures, and, at the entrance to each side gallery erected were low, but solid barricades of stone-filled sacks and boarded shields. At one such barricade blocking their path stood a guard, several very young, almost beardless dwarves in oversized great armor, with battle axes at the ready. Their faces, not yet marred by war and labor scars, were strained to the limit and pale from sleeplessness and fear. Seeing the emerging from darkness familiar and unfamiliar companions, led by Daryl, and then the clanking, shiny steel retinue, they froze for an instant, eyes popping. Then raised an alarmed, breaking cry and closed ranks, pointing trembling blades at the newcomers. "Halt! Who goes? Name yourselves!" cried the tallest one, and his voice quavered, mercilessly betraying both youth and genuine animal fear. Daryl stepped forward into the circle of their torchlight, raising an open palm in a pacifying but imperious gesture. "Friends, Daryl the Ranger, returned from the expedition, from the Iron Caves." He nodded back at the frozen, statue-like spiders. "With us, guests, and news. Urgent news for the elders. Let us pass." The dwarf sentries exchanged glances, lowering their weapons uncertainly and slowly. They recognized Daryl's soot-blackened face and especially the native, weathered physiognomies of Borin and Carl. But their frightened, curious glances with superstitious horror slid over the immobile steel sentinels and the shiny, unnaturally correct hand of Finn, who stood a little behind everyone, instinctively trying to hide it in the folds of his tattered cloak. "He passed through," stammered the eldest of the guards, retreating and letting them through a narrow gap in the barricade. Dumrin and Thorbin are in the main hall, preparing defenses. This was precisely what Daryl expected to hear. He saw from the corner of his eye how word of their unusual, almost mythical return crept ahead of them faster than they themselves. Dwarves working in the halls froze, seeing the mechanical procession, and began to whisper, pointing fingers at each other. The air in the citadel, already thick and heavy with general expectation, now became electrified with new, sharp alarm before this incomprehensible, frightening phenomenon. When they, finally having passed the last corridors and checkpoints, entered the titanic Great Hall, a picture of seething, feverish, almost mad activity awaited them. The hum of hundreds of voices filled all space, mingling with the clang of tools, the squeak of carts, and the dull thud of hammers. Everywhere internal walls were being erected, stores of food and ammunition piled in pyramids. And by the very massive stone throne, upon which like an idol sat Dumrin, stood, bent over, Thorbin, Frondar, Lorien, and several other clan elders. They were absorbed in a heated, almost fierce argument over a huge, charcoal-scribbled map of fortifications spread on a crude table. Dumrin first tore himself from the map and raised his heavy, gray head. His granite, inscrutable face, seeing what had entered his hall, grew even more stony. As if carved from the hardest rock, all conversation around died at once, as if cut by a knife. Hundreds of eyes stared at the strange, dust-covered party and its incredible, shiny steel escort frozen in the doorway, like a vision from another world. The silence that reigned in the titanic main hall was so complete, deep, and ringing that only the hiss of hundreds of torches crackling in iron funnels was heard, and the measured, alien, dry clanking of the mechanical spiders frozen like angular statues right behind the newcomers' backs. All gazes Dumrin's heavy, scorching stare, Thorbin's keen and appraising look, Vrondar's full of mute pain, Lorien's attentive gaze were riveted on them, but most of all, with irresistible magnetism, on the unnaturally shiny, cold metal gleaming hand of Finn and on the immobile, soulless steel sentinels whose red sensors glimmered in the semi-dark, like the eyes of slumbering dragons. Daryl, paying no heed to this general stupor, with firm steps strode forward straight to the crude stone table heaped with maps and scrolls. His face, covered with a layer of road grime, dust, and weariness, was an inscrutable mask, but deep within his eyes, narrowed from the bright light, burned all the same cold, searing fire of rage and awareness of catastrophe kindled in the tunnels after the crimson vision. "We found them," he began directly, without prelude, not wasting precious words on ceremonies or greetings. His raspy, desert silence accustomed voice, low and even, easily carried under the high vaults, reaching the farthest corners of the hall. "The Iron Caves. The Mechanicus live, hide in their steel hives, and no aid will come from them. They will not come." He threw a short, expressive glance at the pale Finn standing slightly behind and with a sharp nod indicated his hand. "They gave us only this, only a hand for a cripple, and their sentinels." Daryl gestured toward the immobile, statue-like spiders, and his gesture was full of bitter irony. "In memory of the old, long-dead Union, as a souvenir. No more than that." A restrained but thick murmur passed through the hall, like the sound of surf before a storm. Thorbin, with purely professional, craftsman's interest, examined the complex construction of the spiders, assessing the forging and articulations, while Dumrin only further narrowed his small, deep-set eyes, trying to weigh not only the physical strength but the hidden strategic meaning of this strange gift. That all this is trivial, dust. Daryl's voice suddenly grew quieter, more subdued, but from this each spoken word acquired incredible, leaden weight, pressing the listeners into the stone floor slabs. On the return journey, on the icy plateau under the very sky, we saw an omen, not natural. He made a long, heavy pause, letting his terrible words penetrate the very consciousness of the listeners, eat into them like acid before delivering the final, irrevocable sentence. From the southeast, from the very blackest, impenetrable depths, from where the dark itself comes, into the very sky struck a pillar of light, not firelight, not lightning, like the color of clotted, old blood and molten hellforge. It pierced the clouds through and stood there, motionless and venomous, like a giant, bloody spear driven by a titan into the very heart of a still living world. At these words, torn from memory's very depth, even the most seasoned warriors and elders ceased to breathe. A dead, freezing silence reigned in the hall, in which only Vrondar, standing beside Dumran leaning on his spear, emitted a quiet, like the deep growl of a wounded beast, sound full of hatred and foreboding. And then from the thick, trembling shadow behind a massive column, where he stood motionless and inconspicuous like a natural part of the most ancient stone, slowly, majestically stepped forward Braid Stoneheart. Not a muscle twitched on his face, but in the incredible depth of his eyes, dark and bottomless as the deepest, forgotten mines beneath the mountain, surged and seethed a whole abyss of ancient knowledge and chilling, prophetic anxiety. Not merely light, Ranger, he spoke, and his voice, low and resonant, was like a distant, subterranean rockfall in the mountain's deepest depths, quiet but making every living soul in the hall shudder to the bones. That was a signal, a summons, carried through all layers of being. All heads turned toward him as if on command. Braid slowly, with dignity, swept his heavy, all-seeing gaze over the assembled, and it seemed this gaze absorbed their collective fear, their bewilderment, their weakness, to refract and reforge them into something else, into steel resolve or bottomless despair. His preparations are complete, he continued, and each word fell into the silence like a separate lead slab, mortaring into consciousness. He has torn the last veils between worlds, trampled boundaries, and challenged the very order of things established at the earth's birth. This light is not a threat or a warning. It is a declaration of war, but not a war of horde against horde, kingdom against kingdom. It is a war against all that lives, breathes, feels, and remembers the true, primordial form of this world. Now he will gather his legions not in secret, by night, but openly, before the eyes of a dying sky. And they will march, north, west, south, against all strongholds, all hearths, all memories of light. He paused, long and heavy, and in this pause, it seemed, was heard the synchronous, quickened beating of thousands of hearts frozen in expectation. Prepare then, children of stone and steel. Braid's voice sounded like a tocsin, like a funeral bell. The time of waiting, of reprieves, is ended. The war of which I warned, the war for the very soul of all creation, has begun here and now. And its first blow, the most crushing blow, will not be against our stone walls. It will be against our will to live, against our last hope. He will come first to break the spirit, to sow discord and despair, and only then to shatter the body. And the first, chief target for this blow will be Nar-Uzdum-Arak. Because I am here, and because here still smolders a fire capable of withstanding the dark. Braid's words hung in the thick, fear-filled air of the hall, turning Daryl's terrible, but still somewhat detached tale from frightening news into a final, irrevocable, and inevitable sentence carved on the tablets of fate. The citadel of Nar-Uzdum-Arak in that moment ceased to be merely a refuge preparing for a hard siege. It became the front line, the first and chief target in a war not for life, but for death. In a war for the very right of all living to exist. Thank you for your attention. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next part and chapter.